Chapter 21 of The Web of the Golden Spider. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. The Web of the Golden Spider by Frederick Bartlett. Chapter 21. The Hidden Cave. In the face of this new emergency, Wilson, as a real man will, quickly regained control of himself. Some power within forced his aching body to its needs. The first shock had been similar to that which a diver feels when receiving no response to a tug upon the lifeline. He felt like a unit suddenly hurled against the universe. Every possible human help was removed, bringing him face to face with basic forces. His brain cleared, his swollen and inflamed eyes came to their own, and his aching arms recovered their strength. The fresh shock had thrown these manifestations so far into the background of his consciousness that they were unable to assert themselves. Stubbs was gone. It was possible, of course, that he lay dead up there within 6 feet of where Wilson stood. Dead, perhaps, with a knife in his back. But this did not suggest itself so strongly as did the probability that he had been seized and carried off. The priest, who was undoubtedly back of this, would not kill him at once. There was little need of that, and he would find him more useful alive than dead. If there had been a fight, if Stubbs had been given a chance, then, of course, the priest would have struck hard and decisively. If he had been carried away uninjured, Stubbs would find his way back here. Of that he was sure. The man was strong, resourceful, and would use his last ounce of strength to relieve his partner. Wilson was in a veritable rat trap. One wall of the cliff projected over his head and the other slanted at such an angle that it was impossible to cling to its smooth surface. And so, although within such a short distance of the top, he was as effectively imprisoned as though he were at the bottom of the chasm. There were just 2 things possible for him to do: wait where he was on the chance that Stubbs might return, or attempt to trace his way further and reach the cave. If he waited, the dark might catch him there, and so he would be forced to remain standing until morning. He hadn't the strength left for that. The other course would also be a bitter struggle to the last remaining spark of energy and might leave him face to face with another blank wall. However, that seemed to offer the bigger chance and would bring death, if death must be, more quickly. He loosened the map from about his throat and, unrolling it, examined it through his smarting eyes. The directions took him almost step by step to the big rock which had barred further progress. He scanned the words which followed. "The path is locked," it read, "but it opens to the faithful, to children of the Gilded One. 12 hands' breadth from the bottom and close to the wall lies the sign. A strong man pressing steadily and with faith against this spot will find the path open to him." 12 hands' breadth from the bottom and close to the wall. But supposing that referred to some real door which had since been blotted out by falling rock, by a later avalanche of which this barrier was a relic? There was but one way to find out, and he must decide quickly. Also, he must memorize the other directions, for he would be unable to consult his map in the darkness of the lower chasm. 30 strides on. If the foot stumbles here, the fall is long. To the left 10 paces, and then the faithful comes to the warmth of the living sun again. The door stands before. Enter ye who are of the sun. Pause if ye be bearded man or unclean. 12 handbreadths up and close to the wall. 30 paces on, then 10. So an opening of some sort appeared, and near it the cave. The cave! It lost its meaning as a treasure house. It was a place to relieve the ache which was creeping back to his arms, which would soothe his straining legs. It was a place to lie down in, this hole hiding pretty jewels and gold plate. He raised his voice in a final call to Stubbs. It was like calling against a wall. His muffled voice was thrown back in his face. With a start he saw that the light about him was fading. He studied his map for the last time to make sure he had made no mistake, and folding it, adjusted it once more about his neck. It was the same laboriously slow process all over again. He shuffled 1 foot ahead, moved his body squat against the wall, and followed with the other foot. Each time he moved, the bitter dust sifted down until it checked his breathing and burned his throat. He had learned to keep his eyes fast closed, but it was a constant effort, for this increased the feeling of dizziness. Always there was a power at his back which drew him out as though he were responding to some powerful magnet. This and the temptation to loosen the tight cords back of his knees, to just let go and sink into relaxation, kept him at a more severe strain than did the actual physical effort. But more than gold was at stake now, more than jewels, though they sparkled like stars. The prize for steady legs and unflinching nerves was a respite from death. If he reached the cave, he would have several days at least before him. Neither thirst nor hunger, fierce masters though they are, can work their will except by slow process. Against them Stubbs would be racing, and he had faith in this man. He did not fear death itself. In thinking of the end, the bitter thing it meant to him was the taking off of her. And every day meant 1 day more of her, another chance of finding her and getting her back to God's country and the life which awaited them there. It did wait for them. In coming here they had left the true course of their life. But it remained for them to take it up when once they should make the beaten tracks again. Now he was trembling along the ragged edge of losing it all that lay behind and all that lay before. But if this was to be so, why had he ever seen that face in the misty dark? Why had he come upon her the second and the third time? Why had chance brought him to her across 10,000 miles of sea? Why had it brought him here? Why, at the beginning, could he not have forgotten her as one forgets those who will flit into one's life and out again? He did not believe in a jesting God. 1 foot forward, the body flat against the wall, a little choke from the dust, then the other foot after. A pause to catch the breath, then 1 foot forward, the body flat against the wall, a little choke from the dust, then the other foot after. Also, he must pause to remember that it was 12 hands up, close to the wall, 30 paces on, then 10. Odd things flashed through a mind long at attention. In the midst of his suffering he found time to smile at the thought that life had reduced itself to such a formula. A single error in this sing-song, such as 10 hands up instead of 12. Was it 10 or 12? 10 hands up and close to the wall. 12 hands up and close to the wall. They sounded alike. Each fell equally well into the rhythm of his song. He stopped in the grip of a new fear. He had forgotten, and trying to recall the rest, he found he had forgotten that too. His mind was a jumble, so that now he did not dare to put out his right foot at all without first feeling with his toe a little beyond. But this passed soon, and his thoughts returned to her, which steadied him instantly. So he came safely to the single step down and accomplished this. Then the other and accomplished that. At the end of a few paces farther he faced the great rock. It had become dark down here now, so dark that he could not see 6 inches ahead. His foot had come against the rock, and then he had felt up with his hands. He found it impossible to stoop sufficiently accurately to measure from the bottom. There was nothing for it but to guess, to try again and again until either it gave or he proved that it would not give. He placed his hand upon the rock at about the height of his chest and threw his weight forward. It was as though he were trying to push the mountain itself to one side. He tried above, below, to the right, to the left, without result. Nothing discouraged, he began again, starting from as low as he could reach and pressing with all his strength at intervals of a few inches. Suddenly, like a door opened from within, the rock toppled to the right where it hung balanced over the precipice, leaving an opening 2 feet wide. It would have been a tight squeeze for Stubbs, but Wilson easily jammed through. He saw that the path continued at a slightly downward slope. 30 paces on and 10 to the left. He repeated the words parrot fashion, and his feet obeyed the instructions automatically. The 30 paces ended so near the edge of crumbling rock that it fell away beneath his toe, leaving some 2 inches over nothing. Had a man walked here without directions, he certainly would have taken his last step and been hurled into the space below. It was pitch dark where he stood. He felt along the wall for the opening which should take him to the left 10 paces. The wall, the path, the depth below the path were all one save to touch alone. It was as though he himself had been deadened to every sense but this. During the last few minutes his brain, too, had dulled so that he now grasped of the great happy world outside was but a vague memory of blue sky before which a shadowy figure danced like a will-o'-the-wisp. But still propelled by the last instinct to leave man before the soul, he put one foot ahead of him, pressed his body flat to the wall, and drew the other after. As he proceeded thus, counting the steps he took, he became aware that the air was fresher. Ahead he saw an opening which was a little less dark than this which stifled him. It was light, though he saw it only faintly through blurred eyes. It was a gray slit coming together at the top. He groped his way almost to the edge, and then to the left he saw a second opening, an opening into another dark. It was the cave. He staggered the few remaining feet and fell prone upon its granite floor. How long he remained so he could not tell. He was not wholly unconscious, but in a state so bordering upon it that he realized nothing but the ecstatic relief which came to his aching body. Still he was able to realize that. Also he knew that he had reached his journey's end, so far as anything more he could do was concerned. He would wait as long as possible, cling to the very last second of life. He must do that for her. That was all that was left. His slowly fading senses flickered back. He roused himself and sat up. In the gloom back of him he made out nothing. The opening was becoming obliterated by the dark without, so that he felt as though in a sealed box, a coffin almost. He felt an impulse to shout, but his dry lips choked this back. He could not sit still. He must act in some way. He rose to his hands and knees and began to grope about without any definite object. There was something uncanny in the thought that this silence had not been broken for centuries. He thought of it as his toes scraped along the granite behind him. Once when he put out his hands near the cave opening, they fell upon what felt like cloth. Something gave before his touch with a dry rattle as of bones. He drew back with the morbid thought that they really were bones. Perhaps some other poor devil had made his way here and died. He felt a craving, greater at first even than his thirst, for light. If only the moon came in here somewhere. If only he could find wood to make a fire. He had a few matches, but these he must keep for something more important than catering to a fear. He turned back to the cave mouth, pressing forward this time to the very edge. He saw opposite him another sheer face of rock which came in parallel to this in which he was imprisoned. His eyes fell below to a measureless drop. But the moon was shining and found its way down into these depths. With his eyes still down, he bathed in this. Then, with returning strength, he turned to the left and his heart came into his throat. There was still more light, but, greater joy than this, he caught sight far below him of a pool of liquid purple. The cold, unshimmering rays of the moon played upon it in silver paths. It was the lake upon whose borders it was possible she stood at that very moment, perhaps looking up at these cliffs. It looked such a gentle thing, this lake. Within its calm waters another moon shone, and about its edges a fringe of dark where the trees threw their shadows. He thrust his body out as far as possible to see more of it. The light and the color were as balm to his eyes. But it brought back another fever. How he would like to thrust his hot head into its depths and drink, drink, drink! The idea pressed in upon him so strongly, with such insane persistence, that he felt as though if he got very near the edge and took a firm grip with his toes, he could reach the water in a jump. It was worth trying. If he took a long breath and got just the right balance, he found himself actually crouching. He fell back from this danger, but he couldn't escape his thirst. He must find water. The dry dust had sifted into his throat, his lungs. His thoughts now centered on nothing else but this. Water stood for everything in the world, for the world itself, because it meant life. Water, water! Nothing else could quench the fever which tore at his throat like a thing with a million sharp claws. Nothing else could clear his brain. Nothing else put the strength back into his legs. Back into the cave he pressed, back into the unknown dark. The flinty sides were cool. He stopped to press his cheek against them, then licked them with his dry tongue. Back, back away from the temptation to jump he staggered. Another step, for all he knew, might plunge him into some dark well. But even so, it wouldn't matter much. There might be water at the bottom. Now and then he paused to listen, for it seemed to him he caught the musical tinkling of dripping water. He pictured a crystal stream such as that in which when a boy he used to fish for trout, tinkling over the clean rock surface, a sparkling fairy waterfall where at the bottom he might scoop up icy handfuls. He tried to pierce the dark to where this sound seemed to be. He struck one of the precious matches. The flame which he held before him was repeated 1,000 times in a shining pool to the left. With a throaty, animal-like cry, he threw himself forward and plunged his hands into the pool. They met a cutting surface of 100 little stones. He groped all around. Nothing but these little stones. He grabbed a handful of them and struck another match. This was no pool of water. This was not a crystal spring. It was nothing but a little pile of diamonds. In a rage, he flung them from him. Jewels, jewels, when he wanted water. Baubles of stone when he thirsted. Surely the gods here who guarded these vanities must be laughing. If each of these crystals had only been a drop of that crystal which gives life and surcease to burning throats! If only these bits could resolve themselves into that precious thing which they mocked with their clearness! Maddened by the visions these things had summoned, he staggered back to the opening. At least he must have air, big cooling draughts of air. It was the one thing which was left to him. He would bathe in it and drink it into his hot lungs. He moved on his hands and knees with his head dropped low between them like a wounded animal. It was almost as though he had become a child once more. Life had become now so elemental. Of all the things this big world furnished, he wanted now but that one thing which it furnishes in such abundance. Just water, nothing else. Water of which there were lakes full and rivers full. Water which thundered by the ton over crags. Water which flooded down over all the earth. And this, the freest of all things, was taken from him, while that for which men cut one another's throat was flung in his face. Yes, he had become just a child once more, a child mouthing for the breast of nature. When he reached the opening, he dropped flat with his head over the chasm. His blurred eyes could still see one thing: the big, cool lake where the moon laughed back at herself, the big, cool lake where the water bathed the shores, the big, cool lake where Joe slept. Joe, love, life, these were just below him. And behind him, within reach of his weak fingers, lay a useless $500 million in precious stones. So he fought for life in the center of the web. End of chapter 21. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 22 of The Web of the Golden Spider. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. The Web of the Golden Spider by Frederick Bartlett. Chapter 22. The Taste of Rope. Stubbs was lying flat upon his chest, staring anxiously down into the fissure where Wilson had disappeared, when suddenly he felt a weight upon his back and another upon each of his outstretched arms. In spite of this he reached his knees, but the powerful brown men still clung. He shook himself as a mad bull does at the sting of the darts. It was just as useless. In another minute he was thrown again, and in another bound hand and foot with a stout grass rope. Without a word, as though he were a slain deer, he was lifted to their shoulders and ignominiously carted down the mountainside. It was all so quickly done that he blinked back at the sun in a daze, as though awaking from some evil dream. But his uncomfortable position soon assured him that it was a reality, and he settled into a sullen rage. He had been captured as easily as a drunken sailor is shanghaied. They never paused until they lowered him like a bundle of hay within a dozen feet of where he had tethered his burros. Instantly he heard a familiar voice jabbering with his captors. In a few minutes the priest himself stepped before him and studied him curiously as he rolled a cigarette. "Where is the other?" he asked. "Find him," growled Stubbs. "Either I or the Golden One will find him, that is certain. There is but one pass over the mountain," he added in explanation. "Maybe. What do you want of us, anyway?" The priest flicked the ashes from his cigarette. "What did you want, by the hut yonder? Your course lay another way." "Ain't a free man a right up there?" "It is the shrine of the Golden One." "It ain't marked such." "But you have learned, now. It is better in a strange country to learn such things before than afterwards." "The same to you, 'bout strange people." The priest smoked idly a few minutes longer. "Where is the other?" he asked again. "Ask your Golden Man." "He knows only the dead. Shall I wait?" "Just as you damned please," growled Stubbs. He saw no use in trying to pacify this devil. Even if he had seen a hope, it would have gone too much against him to attempt it. He felt the same contempt for him that he would of a mutinous sailor. He was just bad, to be beaten by force and nothing else. The yellow teeth showed between the thin lips. "The bearded men are like kings until they lie prostrate like slaves." Stubbs did not answer. His thoughts flew back to Wilson. He pictured his return to find his partner gone. Would he be able to climb out of that ill-fated hole without aid? It was possible, but if he succeeded, he might fall into worse hands. At any cost he must turn suspicion aside from that particular spot. Apparently it had as yet no especial significance, if its existence were known at all to the natives. "My partner," said Stubbs deliberately, "has gone to find the girl." "And you waited for him, up there in the sun?" "Maybe." "He had better have remained with you." "There would have been some dead niggers if he had." "My friend," said the priest, "before morning I shall know if you have told the truth this time. In the meanwhile I shall leave you in the company of my children. I hope you will sleep well." "Do you mean to keep me tied like this till morning?" "I see no other way." "Then damn your eyes if—" But he bit off the phrase and closed his eyes against the grinning face before him. As a matter of fact, he had made a discovery which brought with it a ray of hope. He found that with an effort he was able to bring his teeth against the rope where it passed over his shoulder. His hands were tied behind his back, but with the slack he would gain after gnawing through the rope, he would be able to loosen them. They had taken his revolver, but they had overlooked the hunting knife he always carried within his shirt suspended from his neck, a precaution which had proved useful to him before. The very thing he now hoped for was that they would leave him as he was. The priest departed and did not appear again. The three brown men settled down on their haunches and fell into that state of Indian lethargy which they were able to maintain for days, every sense resting but still alert. With their knees drawn up to their chins, they chewed their coca leaves and stared at their toes, immovable as images. Stubbs looked them over. They did not appear to be strong men. Their arms and legs were rounded like those of women, and their chests were thin. He wondered now why he had not been able to shake them off. Stubbs settled back to wait, but every now and then he deliberately tossed, turning from his back to his side and again to his back. He had two objects in mind: to keep the watchmen alert so that the strain would tell eventually in dulled senses, and to throw them off their guard when the time came that the movements really meant something. But they never even looked up, never shifted their positions. Each had by his side a two-edged sword, but neither revolver nor rifle. His own Winchester still lay in the grass near the hut, if they had not stolen it. In this way several hours passed before he made the first move towards escape. They gave him neither water nor nourishment. So he waited until dark. Then he turned his head until his teeth rested upon the rope. He remained in this position without moving for 10 minutes, and then slowly, carefully began to nibble. The rope was finely knit and as tough as rawhide. At the end of a half hour he had scarcely made any impression at all upon it. At the end of an hour he had started several strands. The wiry threads irritated his lips and tongue so that they soon began to bleed, but this in turn softened the rope a trifle. The 3 brown men never stirred. The stars looked down impartially upon the 4, also upon the girl by the lake and the man in the cave. It was all one to them. He gnawed as steadily and as patiently as a rat. Each nibble soon became torture, but he never ceased save to toss a bit that the guards might not get suspicious. The dark soon blurred their outlines, but he had fixed their positions in his mind so that he could have reached them with his eyes shut. At the end of the 3rd hour he had made his way half through the rope. It took him 2 hours more to weaken 1/2 of the remainder. The pain was becoming unendurable. He quivered from head to foot each time he moved his jaw, for his lips were torn to the quick. His tongue was shredded, his chest damp with blood. Finally he ceased. Then carefully, very carefully, threw back his shoulders so as to bring a strain to the rope. He felt it pull apart and sank to rest a bit. Apparently he lay without moving. The brown men were like dead men. But inch by inch he had drawn the rope slack until he was able to unwind it from his wrists. Then by half inches he moved his hands free, slipping one of them from behind him to his side. It seemed to him as though nature herself had paused to watch and listen. He turned now with his free hand beneath him. Slowly his fingers crept towards his chest, grasped the sheath, freed the blade, and then back to his side once more. He turned to his back, his hand behind him, his fingers grasping the horn handle. His feet were still bound, but he figured that he could raise himself to a sitting posture and sever these with a single slash at the moment he sprang. But he must be quick, must be strong, must be calm. To this end he stretched himself upon his back and waited. If he were able to kill the first man with a single blow, he felt he would stand more than an equal chance with the 2 others. He was an adept in the use of the knife. In a flash he was upright. In another he had cut through the rope on his ankles. He leaped forward, striking deep as his feet touched the earth. The knife sank to the hilt in the brown body. One of the others was reaching for his sword as Stubbs struck home again. But as he drew out his knife, the third was rushing for him with his long sword in his hands. He never reached him. With the skill of long experience, Stubbs threw his knife with the speed of an arrow from a bow. It struck the man just above the heart, and he stumbled over his own feet. Stubbs melted into the shadow of the trees. Once out of sight of the scene of this struggle, he stopped and listened. If this were all of them, there were several things he would get before he returned to the heights. A light breeze rustled the heavy tops above him, but otherwise the world seemed sound asleep. There was not the cracking of a twig, not the movement of a shadow. He ventured back. The 3 forms, save that they had settled into awkward positions, looked very much as they had a few minutes ago when they had stood between him and freedom. He passed them, stopping to recover his knife, and then moved on to where he had hidden the provisions. He took a rope, a can of beef, some crackers, and a small quantity of coca leaves. Then he went to the spring near by and soothed his sore throat and mouth with water. He also filled a quart flask, which he tied behind him. Returning to the cache, he covered it up again and, placing a roll of the coca leaves beneath his tongue, started on the ascent. The dawn was just appearing in a flush of pink when he reached the top. A reconnaissance of the rocks around the hut and at the entrance to the crevice convinced him that no guards had been left here. Evidently, the priest had not thought their capture of supreme importance. It was more an act of precaution than anything else. He felt more refreshed at the top of the peak than he had at the bottom, and, wondering at this, it suddenly occurred to him that this was the effect of the coca leaves. He had heard in Bogova that the natives under its influence were able to endure incredible hardships without other nourishment of any kind. He took a larger mouthful. At any rate, they acted as balm upon his tongue and macerated lips. He felt no inclination to rest. Even had he felt fatigue, his anxiety over Wilson would have forbidden further delay. He fastened one end of his rope securely about a point of rock, and then sat down to study the map once more. He realized that he would need the help of every detail of these directions. Already he had committed them to memory. He was calmer than Wilson about it, and so had remembered them better, but he went over them once more. There was more than treasure at stake this time. He lowered himself into the crevice which had swallowed up his companion, with almost a sense of relief at being for the moment beyond the power of the priest. He was tempted to cut the rope behind him, but a brief examination convinced him that this would be foolhardy. He still had sufficient left for an emergency, in case the rope was drawn up from above. 2 men should stand a better chance of getting out of here than would a single man. At the end of the first 10 feet along the narrow path, Stubbs felt much less confident than at the start that Wilson was alive, and he worked his way along the dangerous course with increasing fear. It was with a gasp of relief that he finally saw the opening ahead of him which marked the end. He paused to shout. He received no reply. He called his comrade's name again. The dark walls about him caught his voice and imprisoned it. Taking new risks, he pushed ahead. To the left he saw the cave mouth. He stopped once more, half fearing what he should find, and ran the remaining steps. At the entrance to the cave itself, he stumbled over a prostrate body. End of chapter 22. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 23 of The Web of the Golden Spider. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. The Web of the Golden Spider by Frederick Bartlett. Chapter 23. The Spider Snaps. Stooping, Stubbs ran his hand down the length of Wilson's arm and felt for his pulse. He caught a weak but steady beat. Prying open his mouth, he poured a large mouthful of water down the dry throat. Wilson quickly revived and begged for more. "No, m' son, this'll do for now. You'll need it worse later on. And I'm darned glad to see yer again." How long have I been here, Stubbs?" panted Wilson. "Nigh 24 hours." "A day, a whole day wasted." "And another cross agin your friend the priest." "Was it he?" "The same." He gave Wilson a little food and a wisp of the coca leaves to chew and briefly told him what he had just been through. He concluded with a wave of his hand about him. So here we are at last, and a crew of savages waitin' for us at the top, which makes a fine and fittin' end for any voyage upon which I embarks. Water, give me more water." Stubbs rested the bottle to the man's lips a moment, and then had to fight with him to get it away. "Now," said Stubbs, "if you've got the breath, tell me, has ye explored at all?" Wilson shook his head. He answered vaguely, his thoughts still upon the one thing. "A day wasted, and the priest on his way. He said within a day, didn't he, Stubbs? Lord, we've got to get out of here. We've got to get to her. He'll kill them both." Wilson struggled to his feet, and plunged toward the exit to the cave. Stubbs was upon him in a second and bore him down. "God, man, ain't ye any sense left at all?" A second later he repented his sharp speech, and added, "There, lay still a moment, lad. I knows how you feel. But we might's well look around and find out how much bigger damned fools we are. You've got to get your strength before you can move back over that course." "The treasure is there," whispered Wilson. "But, Stubbs, I want more water, buckets of it." "What's there?" "Diamonds. Diamonds, and not a drop of water." Stubbs did not believe it. He took it to be the hallucination of a man weak with thirst. But one thing was settled in his mind. If the cave were empty, he wouldn't waste any more time here. Danger was increasing with every minute. He pawed his way into the rear of the cave, and had not gone 10 feet before he stumbled over the same pile Wilson had found. He seized a handful of the stones and made his way back to the light. The jewels sparkled in his rough palm like chips from the stars themselves. They were of all sizes, from a beechnut to a pecan. Even roughly cut and polished as they were, they still flashed back their rainbow hues with pointed brilliancy. He picked out a large yellow diamond which even in this dim light glowed like molten gold in a fog. Another which imprisoned the purple of the night sky, and another tinged with the faint crimson of an afterglow. Jumbled together in his hand, they were a scintillating pile of tiny, living stars, their rays fencing in a dazzling play of light. Even to Stubbs, who knew nothing of the stones, they were so fascinating that he turned them over and over with his finger to watch their twinkling iridescence. Just those he held there now were such as a lapidary would spend his life willingly in the getting. If not another stone were found in the cave, these alone represented a fortune worthy of the expedition. Each stone as it stood was worth probably from $300 to $800, and some of the larger would run into the thousands. It was difficult to realize their full value here where they counted for so little, no more than the rays of the stars themselves, here where so many others lay in a heap like broken glass. Vaguely Stubbs grasped the fact that he had in his possession the worth of many good ships and freedom for the rest of his life. Yet he thrilled less with this thought than he did with the sheer joy of discovery. A man will cherish a dime he picks up on the street more than he does a $5 bill in his pocket. It was this spirit of treasure trove that got into his blood, sending a tingle of new life through his veins. He tried to rouse Wilson to it. "Come here, man," he shouted. "Come here and see what we've got. God, there's millions in this cave." But Wilson lifted his head indifferently. "I don't give a damn," he answered. "You haven't seen 'em sparkle. You haven't got it into your head. You're rich, richer than Danbury." He hurried back to where Wilson sat and thrust the jewels before his eyes. "Do you see 'em?" he cried excitedly. "Bigger'n your thumb!" For a second his old-time suspicion and doubt returned. "But maybe," he added sorrowfully, "maybe they're just glass. Just my luck." Nevertheless, he believed sufficiently in them to return to the quest. He struck match after match, wandering farther and farther into the darkness, hoping to find something with which he could make light enough to see around him. He gave a little cry of joy as he came upon an old-time altar light, a platter of oil containing a crude wick. He lighted this. The flame sputtered feebly, died down, then revived to a big, steady flame. With his arms at his side, his mouth wide open, he gaped at what the light revealed. The cave was not large; this lamp disclosed its boundaries. It also disclosed other things, chief of which was a leering idol some 3 feet tall, which squatted cross-legged with one hand extended. This hand held a polished diamond larger than a walnut. The eyes were of ruby which, catching the light, burned with ghoul-like ferocity, while the mouth grinned with a smile which strangely resembled that of the priest. The image was of gold. To the right and left, piled up as though they had been hastily thrown together, was a jumble of vases, bowls, plates, shields, all of beaten gold. They made a heap some 4 feet high, and from 6 to 8 feet broad at the base. Strewn about the foot of this were many little leather bags tied at the top with dried sinews. Minute after minute Stubbs stared at this sight in silence. There was more gold here than he thought existed in the world, so much that it lost its value. Here was enough almost to load down a ship. If he could crowd a few $100s into a bag small enough to stuff into his pocket, this must run up into the millions. He had always spoken of a man worth $1 million with a certain amount of awe and doubt, and here lay 10, perhaps 50 times that amount. At the end of 40 years of sailing the seas, he had saved a little over $3,000 against the days he should be old and feeble. $3,000! 2 or 3 of those stones he had slipped into his pocket, 4 or 5 of these plates of which there were hundreds. He moved forward and tried to lift one of the big vases of crudely beaten gold. With his full weight against it, he could scarcely move it. Farther on there was a bar of gold heavier than 3 men could carry. To the left of this there was a pile of golden shields studded with jewels, strange ornaments, and heavy plates. Back of this he caught a glimpse of still other ingots of gold in the shadows. And always the big image held extended towards him with a cynical leer the big polished diamond, which seemed rather to give out light from within itself than to reflect the altar flames. It blazed with a brilliancy that he had never seen equaled, save by the stars on faultless winter nights. He was too dumbfounded at first to take it all in. He turned about in a circle, resting his eyes again upon one thing after another, and then raised his hand and looked at that to make sure that he was seeing correctly, was not the victim of some strange illusion. Yes, his eyes were all right. He saw his calloused, big-jointed hand, the hand which had labored so long for a millionth part of what he now saw here. The gold and the jewels were within arm's reach of him. There was no longer any doubt about that. His luck must have turned. He moved back to where Wilson still lay sprawled out upon his back, only half conscious of his surroundings. He tried to speak calmly, but he blurted out, "God, man, there's tons of it!" Wilson did not move or speak. Shiploads of it. Man, wake up and see what's afore your eyes." "What is it, Stubbs?" "Gold, gold, gold! The stuff that outside here you has to fight to get a pinch of. The stuff I've sailed around the world to get a handful of. The stuff you've come so far on the bare chance of seeing." "It's here, then? The treasure is here?" "More than ever you dreamed of. Small wonder that Sorez was willin' to take chances agin the priest if he knew of this." Wilson brushed his hand over his eyes. The name roused him. This meant getting back to Sorez, getting back to him with proof of the treasure and so releasing the girl. He made his feet and stood a moment with his hand upon Stubbs's shoulder. "I'm glad, Stubbs," he answered. Now let's get back to her." "Aye, we'll get back, but first we've got to figure out some way for gettin' of this stuff out." As a matter of fact, they learned that they were really facing something of a problem. It was a marvel however these things were got down here, but it would be a still greater task to get them out again. 20 fanatical worshippers of the sun god gave their lives to bearing these priceless offerings from the lake to this cave with the incentive of winning everlasting happiness. It was a different problem for 2 tired and nerve-exhausted men to retrace their steps. Even if it were possible to get the treasures to the surface, it would need a small army of men and burros to carry it over the mountains to civilization, and another small army to defend it while on the journey. It would be almost equally impossible, probably, for them ever again to reach this cave. If they were successful in getting out of this country alive, now that the priest was roused, and the natives incensed over the death of their fellows, it certainly would be sure death ever to return. As for organizing a company either at Bogova or in America for the purpose of removing the treasure, Stubbs had the usual independent man's distrust of such means. It became clearer to him every minute that the only share of this hoard of which they ever could be sure was what they might now take out with them. This practically eliminated the vast store of golden implements, for it was impossible to carry even the smallest of them on their shoulders, ever so rough and dangerous a trail as this. It began to look as though they had reached this treasure at length merely to be tantalized by it. The very thought was like a nightmare. His eyes fell upon the small leather bags. Stooping, he picked up one of them, untied it, and poured its contents upon the cave floor. A flashing stream of rubies rippled out and glowed at his feet in a tiny blood-red heap. And there were a dozen more of these bags in sight. "Lord, man!" he exclaimed below his breath. "It's enough to make you believe you're dreamin'." The jewels gave him fresh courage. Here, at any rate, was a fortune which was within their present reach. They could carry these things back with them, even though they were forced to leave the bulk of the treasure in its heavier form. A single one of these little leather bags was sufficient to repay them for their trouble, if they didn't get anything else. But one thing was sure: their single chance of escaping with even these was to start at once. The priest would undoubtedly have the whole region up in arms before dark, and if he didn't find them before, would have a force at the mountain pass. It went against his grain to abandon such riches as these, but life and a few million was better than death with all the gold in the world piled about your tomb. To Wilson, who in the last few minutes had become more himself, the treasure still meant just one thing: the opportunity of freeing Joe. With this evidence, he could return to Sorez and persuade him of the futility of his search in the lake itself, and induce him to join his party and escape while there was time. If he didn't succeed in this, he would take the girl even if he had to do so by force. "It's a case of grab and jump," said Stubbs. "You gather up the loose stones on the floor and I'll collect the bags. The sooner we gets to the top, the better." Stubbs took the altar light and made a careful search of the bottom of the cave for jewels. These were the things which embodied in the smallest weight the most value. It made him groan every time he passed an ingot of gold or some massive vase which he knew must run into the thousands. But at the end of 10 minutes he felt better. The stones alone were sufficient to satisfy even the most avaricious. About the base of the grinning idol they found 14 leather bags, each filled with gems. The loose diamonds which had been roughly thrown into the small pile would fill 4 bags more. Even Wilson became roused at sight of these. He began to realize their value and the power such wealth would give him. If the girl was still alive, he now had the means of moving an army to her aid. If she was still alive— But the day was waning, and the priest, now thoroughly aroused, doubtless moving towards her intent upon wiping out every stranger, man or woman, in the hills. Stubbs was for going farther back into the cave and exploring some of the recesses into which they had not yet looked at all. But Wilson, with returning strength, became impatient again. The coca leaves which he had chewed constantly brought him new life. "Lord! Would you sell the girl for a few more bags of jewels, Stubbs?" he burst out. The latter straightened instantly and came nearer. But before he had time to speak, Wilson apologized. "No, I know better, comrade, but I can't wait any longer to get to her. I'm 5 years older than I was a day ago." The while they were gathering the little bags full of jewels, the big image in the corner smiled his smile and offered them the big diamond in his hand. The while they buckled the bags about their waists, as precious belts as ever men wore, the image smiled and offered. As they moved towards the mouth of the cave, it still insisted. Yet for some reason neither man had felt like taking the stone. Stubbs felt a bit superstitious about it, while Wilson felt enough reverence, even for heathen gods, to refrain. But still it smiled and offered. In the flickering flare of the altar light the stone burned with increasing brilliancy. It was as though it absorbed the flames and, adding new fuel, flashed them forth again. Wilson led the way out. Before they left the cave, Stubbs turned. He saw the image once again, and once again the stone. The temptation was too great, especially now that they were on the point of leaving, perhaps forever. He started back, and Wilson tried to check him. "I wouldn't, Stubbs. Those eyes look too ugly. It is only the mouth that smiles, and—" "You haven't turned heathen yourself, have you?" he called back. He stepped forward and clutched it. But the jewel was fastened in some way, although it seemed a bit loose. He pulled strongly upon it, and the next second leaped back, warned in time by a suspicious rumbling above his head. He looked down to see a slab of granite weighing half a ton on the spot where he had stood a moment before. It was an ingenious bit of mechanism arranged to protect the treasure. The jewel had been attached by a stout cord which, when pulled, loosed the weight above. Not only this, but it became evident in a few seconds that it loosed also other forces, whether by design or chance, the two men never determined. They had pressed back to the path outside the cave when they heard a rumble like distant thunder, followed instantly by a grinding and crashing. Before their eyes a large section of the cliff crashed down over the cave itself and into the chasm below. They didn't wait to see what followed, but made their way along the path as fast as they dared. Neither man spoke again until a half hour later, after a journey that was like a passage through hell. They lay exhausted in the sunlight above the chasm. The thunder of tumbling rock still pounded at their ears. End of chapter 23. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 24 of The Web of the Golden Spider. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. The Web of the Golden Spider by Frederick Bartlett. Chapter 24. Those in the Hut. In an angle formed by two cliff sides, within a stone's throw of the Lake of Guadiva, a native, Flores by name, had built himself a hut. Here he lived with his mate Lotta in a little nirvana of his own, content with his love and his task of tending a flock of sheep which furnished them both with food and clothing. Few came near this hut. The sky above, the lake before, and the mountains round about were all his and his alone, even as was the love of the dark-eyed woman near him. Within their simple lives they had sounded the depths of despair and reached the heights of bliss. The woman Lotta was the daughter of a chieftain of the tribe of Chibca, one whose ancestry went far back into the history of the Golden One. Some of them had been priests, some of them guards, and all of them had fought hard for their god. But the father of this girl incurred the displeasure of the priest and finally, not yielding to discipline, his wrath. The stern autocrat of these tribes condemned him to extreme punishment, a fast of 30 days in the hut upon the mountain top, the hut of the Golden God. Cowed and frightened, the man, somewhat feeble with sickness, bade good-bye to his daughter and climbed the rugged path. Below, the girl waited day after day until the strain became unbearable. She ventured, knowing well what the penalty was, to visit him with food. She found him groaning upon the stone floor, eaten by fever and racked with pain. She nursed him until her supplies were exhausted and then came down for more, choosing a secret path which she in her rambles as a girl had discovered. It was then she heard whispered among the gossips news of a white stranger with marvelous powers who was hiding in the hut of a neighbor. It was just after the battle with the men from the sea, a battle terrible in its ferocity. This man was one of the refugees from the scattered army, sheltered at first for gold and later because of the power he possessed of stopping pain. A wounded native, member of the family which sheltered him, had been brought in suffering agonies, and the stranger had healed him with the touch of a tiny needle. Lotta heard these things, and that night found the stranger's hiding place and begged him to follow. He knew enough of the native language to understand, and to make his bargain. If she would guide him to the mountain pass, he would follow. The man was Sorez. The next few hours were burned into Sorez's mind forever. At her heels he had clawed his way up the steep hillside, expecting at every step a spear thrust in his back. He tore his hands and knees, but, drawn on by a picture of the girl moving shadow-like in the moonlight ahead of him, he followed steadily after, pausing for breath once he saw the dark fringe of trees below the lava slopes, the twinkle of the campfires, and over all the clear stars. But this region here was a dead region. He felt as if he were moving through some inferno, some ghastly haunt of moaning specters, with the dark-faced girl guiding him like some dead love. On they climbed in silence until his head began to swim with the exertion and the rarefied air. Suddenly the girl disappeared as though she had dropped over a precipice. To the left he saw a small path leading over a yawning chasm. She beckoned, and he felt his way along. Then they came upon a tiny plateau upon which had been built a hut of rocks. The scene within was terrible. Upon the stone floor lay a brown-skinned skeleton with bulging eyes and clawing fingers muttering incoherently. Sorez could do nothing but administer a small injection of the soothing drug, but this brought instant relief, and with it a few moments of sanity. The doctor had picked up a small vocabulary and gathered from what the dying man muttered that he, Sorez, a very much bruised and weary mortal, was being mistaken for one from heaven. A smile lighted the haggard face of the invalid and the bony hands came together in prayer. The girl bent over him and then drew back in horror. She met the eyes of her father in some new-found wonder, gasping for breath. Then she bent her ear once more. The message, whatever it was repeated. Still, as though half doubting, she moved to the rear of the hut and pounded with a large rock against what was apparently the naked face of the cliff in which the hut was built. It swung in, revealing a sort of shrine. Within this reposed a golden image. She turned her eyes again upon her father and then, without hesitation, took out the idol and handed it to Sorez. "The God of gods," she whispered, bending low her head. "But I don't want your God," protested the doctor. "You must. He says it is for you to guard." He had taken it carelessly to humor the dying man, and when the latter closed his eyes for all time, Sorez remembered that the heathen image was still in his possession. He started to return it to the shrine, but the girl threw herself before him. "No! The trust is yours." Well, it would be a pleasant memento of an incident that was anything but pleasant. He brought it down the mountainside and put it beneath his blanket. It was not until several days later that bit by bit he came to a realization of that which he had so lightly taken. The old man who brought his food whispered the news through ashen lips. "The Golden One is gone." "Who is the Golden One?" "The Golden God in the hut above who guards the secret of the sacred treasure. It is said that some day this image will speak and tell where the lost altar lies." The whole tribe was in the grip of an awful terror over this disappearance, but the priest proved master of the situation. "It will be found," he said. In the excitement, Sorez found his opportunity to escape, with the help of the girl, the image still beneath his coat, the image fated to light in him the same fires which drove on Raleigh and Quesada. Before he reached the home trail he had a chance to see this strange priest of whom he had heard so much in connection with the rumored treasure in the lake. He came upon him, a tall, sallow-faced man, when within an hour of safety. Sorez had never before met eyes such as looked from beneath the skull-like forehead of this man. They bored like hot iron. The priest spoke good English. "Leave the image," he said quietly. Sorez, his hand upon a .32 caliber revolver, laughed, even as Quesada had laughed, and disappeared in the dark. The next time he met the priest was many months later and many thousand miles from the Andes. The girl who, at the command of her father, had given Sorez the image was made an exile in consequence of this act by a decree of the priest. But the thread of love is universal. It is the strain out of which springs all idealism, even the notion of God, and as such is bounded by neither time nor place. It is in the beating hearts of all things human, the definition, perhaps, of humanity. Civilization differs from savagery in many things, but both have in common, after all, whatever is eternal, and love is the thing alone which we know to be eternal. Just human love, love of man for woman and woman for man. Flores followed her into the mountains among which they had both grown. He built a shelter for her, bought sheep and toiled for her, and with her found the best of all that a larger life brings to many. The priest, of course, could have easily annihilated the two, but he hesitated. There was something in the hearts of his people with which he dare not tamper. So the two had been able to live their idyll in peace, though Flores slept always with one eye open and his knife near. It was quite by accident that Sorez and the tired girl came upon the two at the finish of his second journey into these mountains. The woman in the hut recognized him instantly and bade him welcome. The one-room structure was given up to the women while Flores built near it a lean-to for himself and Sorez. This simplified things mightily for the exhausted travelers, and gave them at once the opportunity for much-needed rest. They slept the major part of 2 days, but Sorez again showed his remarkable recuperative powers by awaking with all his old-time strength of body and mind. He accepted the challenge of the lake and mountains with all his former fearlessness. He thought no more of the danger which lurked near him than he did of the possible failure of his expedition. It was this magnificent domination of self, this utter scorn of circumstance, which made such a situation as this in which he now found himself with the girl possible. No ordinary man would, with so weak a frame, have dared face such a venture. To the girl he had been as thoughtful and as kind as a father. He lavished upon her a care and affection that seemed to find relief for whatever uneasiness of conscience he felt. Though Sorez realized that the priest must know of his presence here and would spare no effort to get the image, he felt safe enough in this hut. With a few simple defenses Flores had made secret approach to the hut practically impossible. The cliff walls protected them from the rear, while approach from the front could be made only by the lake, save for short distances on either side. Across these spaces Flores had sprinkled dry twigs, and so sensitive had his hearing become by his constant watchfulness that he would awake instantly upon the snapping of one of these. As a further precaution, he placed his sheep at night within this enclosure, knowing that no one could approach without exciting them to a panic. Moreover, Sorez suspected that the priest had kept secret from the tribe his failure to recover the image after his long absence in pursuit of it. Not only was such a loss a reflection on his power, but it challenged the power of the Golden Man himself. Would the sun god allow such a thing? Could the image be gone with no divine manifestations of its loss? Such questions were sure to be asked. The priest had no men he could trust with a secret so important. He would work alone. The matter would end with a rifle bullet or a stab in the dark, if it ended in favor of the priest; with the vanishing of the treasure and the return of the image, if in favor of Sorez. During the 3 days they had spent at the lake, Joe had grown very serious and thoughtful. This seemed such a fairy world in which they were living that things took on new values. The two were seated around the fire, with Flores and his wife in the shadows, when the girl spoke of new fears which had possessed her lately. Led on as much by what she herself saw and continued to see in the crystals, by the fascination she found in venturing into these new and strange countries, but above all by the domination of this stronger and older personality she had until now followed without much sober thinking. If she hesitated, if she paused, he had only to tell of some rumor of a strange seaman in the city of Bogova, or repeat one of the dozen wild tales current of Americans who had gone into the interior in search of gold and there been lost for years, to turn up later sound and rich. He had hurried her half asleep from the house at Bogova and frightened her into silent obedience by suggesting that Wilson might by force take her back home when upon the eve of finding her father. She had looked again into the crystal and as always had seen him wandering among big hills in a region much like this. What did it all mean? She did not know, but now a deeper, more insistent longing was lessening the hold of the other. Her thoughts in the last few days had gone back more than ever they had to the younger man who had played, with such vivid, brilliant strokes, so important a part in her life. She felt, what was new to her, a growing need of him, a need based on nothing tangible, and yet none the less eager. She turned to Sorez. "I am almost getting discouraged," she said. "When shall we turn back?" "Soon, soon. Have you lost interest in the treasure altogether?" "The treasure never mattered very much to me, did it? You have done your best to help me find my father, and for that I am willing to help you with this other thing. But I am beginning to think that neither of the quests is real." She added impulsively, "Twice I have left the most real thing in my life, once at home and once in Bogova. I shall not do it again." "You refer to Wilson?" "Yes. Here in the mountains, here with Flores and his wife, I am beginning to see." "What, my girl?" "That things of today are better worth than things of tomorrow." Sorez shifted a bit uneasily. He had come to care a great deal for the girl, to find her occupying the place in his heart left empty by the death of the niece who lived in Boston. He was able less and less to consider her impersonally, even in the furtherance of this project. He would have given one half the fortune he expected, really to be able to help the girl to her father. He had lied, taking advantage of this passionate devotion to entice her to the shores of this lake with her extraordinary gift of crystal seeing. He was beginning to wonder if it were worth while. At any rate, he would be foolish not to reap the reward of his deceit at this point. "Well," he concluded brusquely, "we must not get gloomy on the eve of victory. Tomorrow the moon is full. Do you think you will be strong enough to come with me tomorrow night to the shrine of the Golden Man?" "Yes," she answered indifferently. "He chose his own, and surely he will not desert the agent of his choosing." "No," answered the girl. Her eyes rested a moment upon the silver lake before her and then upon the cliffs beyond. She had an odd desire this evening to get nearer to those walls of granite. A dozen times she had found her eyes turning to them, and each time she obeyed the impulse it was followed by a new longing for David. She wished he were here with her now. She wished he was to be with her tomorrow night when Sorez took her out upon the lake with him. She did not mind gazing into the eyes of the image, of sinking under their spell, but now, this time, she would feel better if he were near her. She had a feeling as though he were somewhere near her, as though he were up there, near the cliffs which she faced. End of chapter 24. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 25 of The Web of the Golden Spider. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. The Web of the Golden Spider by Frederick Orrin Bartlett. Chapter 25. What the Stars Saw. The moon shone broadly over a pool of purplish quicksilver. A ragged fringe of trees bordered it like a wreath. The waters were quiet, very, very quiet. They scarcely rippled the myriad stars which glittered back mockingly at those above. The air over and above it all was the thin air of the skies, not of the earth. It was as silent here as in the purple about the planets. Man seemed too coarse for so fine a setting. Even woman, nearest of all creatures to fairy stuff, must needs be at her best to make a fitting part of this. From out of the shadows of this fringe of trees there stole silently another shadow. This moved slowly like a funeral barge away from the shore. As it came full into the radius of that silver light, a light matching the dead, it seemed more than ever one with sheeted things, for half prone upon this raft lay a girl whose cheeks were white against the background of her black hair, and whose eyes saw nothing of the world about her. She stared more as the dead stare than the living, stared into the shining eyes of the golden image which she held with rigid arms upon her knees, the image which had entangled so many lives. Her bosom moved rhythmically, slowly, showing that she was not dead. The golden image stared back at her. Its eyes caught the moonbeams in its brilliant surfaces, so that it looked more like a living thing than she who held it. Facing them, standing bolt upright save when he stooped a trifle a reach forward with his paddle, was Sorez, who might have passed for Charon. His thin frame, his hollow cheeks, the intense look of his burning eyes gave him a ghostly air. The raft moved without a sound, scarcely rippling the waters before it, scarcely disturbing in its wake the gaunt shadows cast by Sorez, which followed them like a pursuing spectre. He studied keenly the dumb shores which lay in a broad circumference about them. He could see every yard of the lake and saw that they themselves were the only scar upon its mirror surface. Peak upon peak looked down upon them, and higher, star upon star. Dead, indifferent things they were, chance accessories to this drama. They awaited the touch of sterner forces than those of man for their changes. He who drove the raft along breathed as one who was trying hard to control himself in the face of a great emotion. His eyes continually shifted from the girl to the shores, then back again to the girl. In this way he reached a position near the middle of the lake. Here he paused. He seemed to hesitate at the next step as though a great deal depended upon it. His lips moved, but he seemed afraid to break the silence. The girl remained immovable, still staring into the glittering eyes of the image. He studied her eagerly as though he would lead her mind before he spoke, for upon the first reply to his question depended the success or failure of all he had dared, of all he had undertaken. As she answered, either he would be the laughing-stock of the world, or the most famous of modern adventurers, a comparatively poor man, or the richest in jewels of all the world. Suddenly he stooped, and bending close to the ear of the girl, said very distinctly, "We are on the Lake of Guadiva. It is said that here below the waters lies the shrine of the Golden One. Can you see below the waters? Is the shrine here?" Her lips moved uncertainly. An indistinct muttering followed. He held his breath in his excitement. "The shrine, it is below." His color changed from gray to the red of youth. His eyes brightened. His whole body seemed to grow young with new strength. He asked the second question with feverish impatience. From here, is it straight ahead, to the left, or the right?" "Ahead, and I can't see. "Look deeper, and you can see." "To the right," she said decisively. He dipped the paddle deep and put all his strength into the strokes. For 100 yards the ripples broke in front of the clumsy craft. Again he stopped and asked the direction. Her lips trembled over the words, exactly like those of one talking in sleep. It was always with an effort that she was able sufficiently to concentrate herself to give voice to what she saw. This time she bade him continue straight ahead. So he proceeded for another 100 yards. In this way he crossed to within an eighth of a mile of the opposite shore. Here she bade him pause, in answer to his questioning. He was not an emotional man, but he had never been under such a tension as during this maneuvering, or felt such a variety of sensations. "To the left," she muttered, and then almost querulously, "I can't find it. It is near here, but I do not see it." She moved him almost in a circle, and still back and forth, without seeming able to locate the spot for which she sought. They were opposite two high cliffs which revealed a deep fissure between them. Now and again her head turned upwards to this spot and her face became troubled, the brows coming together in a puzzled scowl, which sometimes faded away into a look of fear. Once, with a startled cry, she put her hands up over her eyes and swayed back and forth with low moaning. He roused her from this by a sharp command, and she turned again to the lake with no trace of this disturbance. He began to get worried as she reached no definite spot. It was possible that she could not bring him to any smaller radius than this circle. This would leave a doubt so serious as, after all, to bring things to nothing. He stooped again. "The altar! It is near here? We must find it, find it! Look deep, look in all directions. Look without fear. You must find it, the altar of the Golden One with its treasure. You must find it." But she only raised her head and fixed her staring eyes upon the dark cliffs. She looked as though she were listening very intently, as to a cry from a distance of which she was not sure. Her lips formed the word "David." He caught it, and it startled him so that for a moment he followed her eyes, listening too. But beyond there was nothing but the sober height of barren rock standing stark against the sky. There was no movement below on the shore. There was no shadow upon the lake. Yet with eyes fixed upon this scene she still called the name, "David! David!" Sorez placed his hand upon her forehead. He concentrated the full power of his mind upon the quest. "Below! Below! You must look below, not above. You must see nothing but the altar of the Golden One. Below, deep, deep. Look. Search until you find it." Her features became smooth once more, and she obeyed the command. She said very distinctly this time, "The altar is here." "Below us?" "Here." He doubted even as the blood rushed through his veins with the gladness of her words. He doubted as one will to prolong the joy of the truth. But there still remained much else to be learned. It was possible that the treasure was not so great as had been reported. If only she could see it lying there, if only she could tell him of the bars of yellow gold, of the glittering heaps of precious stones, of the jumbled pile of golden plate which had lain there for so long. The thought of it was enough to start the fever of desire. He wished even that he could force her to go down there and bring up to him a bit that he himself could touch and see and weigh. As he stood beside her with the lust of this thing in his eyes, a shadow detached itself from the shore. It may have been only the reflection of a tiny cloud, but there were no clouds. It may have been just a bit of driftwood, but it moved slowly and steadily towards the raft. Sorez bent above the girl again. "The Golden Man will tell you. Look into his eyes very hard." The girl grasped the image more tightly and obeyed. "Now go below, deep, deep." For some reason, even as she had done in the room when first she had held this thing, she drew back in fear at this. "No, no," she pleaded. But Sorez had lost sight of her as a personality now. She was nothing but a means to this one end, nothing but an adjunct to this heathen idol. He repeated his command more decisively, more sternly. His words were sharp, cold. The shadow which had left the shore still came nearer, silently, swiftly. The girl rested her frightened eyes upon the brilliant jewels set below the ugly, squat brow. They glowed in answer. They sparkled like tiny fires. Her face grew strained, her breathing became more rapid. "Deeper! Deeper!" The shadow had come very near. Had the girl not been looking so intently into the crystal eyes, she could have seen, could have warned. The moon now showed it to be a canoe, and in the canoe a man. The man was very lean and his uncovered head was close shaven. His eyes were very like those in the image. The girl shuddered. "Deeper! Deeper!" came the relentless command. Her voice came back muffled as though from a distance. "It is dark, dark." She began to gasp. Then suddenly she placed her hand to her head. "I see no gold! I see no gold!" Sorez sank to his knees before the girl. His face was chalk white. "Gone? Is it gone?" The shadow was now beside the raft. The shadow was now behind Sorez. The shadow placed one foot upon the raft, but it paused there a moment at the cry which brought Sorez also to attention. "Father!" screamed the girl. "Father!" Sorez stared straight ahead of him in a frenzy. Then the shadow sprang, throwing his arms about the tall figure. Without a cry, Sorez sank under him. He made a brief struggle, but he was too weak to overcome the demon strength of the man who bore him down. With remarkable dexterity, the priest bound him hand and foot before he had recovered fully from the shock of the fall. The girl was now murmuring to herself, murmuring the one word, "Father!" It was an appealing, frightened cry, full of doubt, uncertainty, and yet of hungry love. For a second it held the attention of both men, the priest taking a step nearer the girl and looking at her almost curiously. Sorez knew this was the end, but he was a good gambler. Having lost all, he accepted his fate with stoicism. He kept his head clear, clear enough to do the thing which marked him a man. He squirmed about until he faced the girl. With every ounce of strength in him, he shouted his final command to her. "Awake! Awake!" The girl stirred uneasily. The priest reached for his knife, not understanding. "Awake!" repeated Sorez, and his voice quivered with the intensity of his earnestness. "Awake!" The girl trembled and seemed to fight her way to consciousness as one after a deep dive struggles to the top. She gasped for breath. Her eyes fluttered open, closed, fluttered open again. She roused herself to a sitting posture, and the image dropped from her lap. The priest snatched it up as the girl shrank back from him. For a moment The two stared at each other. The priest was held motionless. Then, as Sorez hitched a bit to one side, he turned to his work. Sorez hoped for nothing but a swift end. The cruel face of the other left nothing to question, nothing else to hope. But now that the girl had shaken off the influence of the image, he was easier. There was but one thing left to try, even though the eyes looking down into his hinted at nothing of mercy. He must save the girl if possible. As the priest bent over him, he found his voice. "Listen to me a moment. I have nothing to ask for myself. I took my chances, and I lost. But the girl here, she is innocent of even wishing for your treasure." "Why, then, is she here?" "I brought her here." "You could not, against her will." Sorez moistened his lips and explained, "She came on another mission. She came in search of a father who has been long missing." "To this lake? To this spot, with the image in her lap?" "No, this part of it is at my prompting. She but obeyed me." The priest turned away impatiently. He saw the girl crouching in terror of him. He moved nearer. He saw her black eyes. They remained on his strangely immovable. He felt something of a tremor. Things about him became blurred for a moment. He shook himself free. "I have heard too many stories," he said. "But, good God, you believe this?" burst out Sorez. "You haven't the heart to revenge yourself upon her. You—" He checked himself. He knew the man would do as he most feared. This, then, was to be his punishment, to know that he had brought the girl to such an end as this, that he had won her trust and confidence and rewarded it with such torture as this demon might mete out to her. The priest might even slay her before his eyes. He strained at the rope which bound him until it tore into his flesh. The waters played about the raft. The stars danced in the ripples. Sorez brought himself to try once more. "If you have a spark of pity in your heart, you will do her no harm. Listen. I lied to the girl. I brought her here on the hope that she might find this father who has been a long time gone from home. He was a sea captain, and I told her that many captains had been lost here in the mountains and been found again. I told her that I had seen her father in Bogova. That is why she came." "To the lake?" Sorez had but a second in which to decide. If he told the priest of the girl's power, the latter might slay her to bury the secret, or torture her to betray it to him. No, it would be safer to leave the priest merely suspicious. "As I am about to die," affirmed Sorez solemnly, "that is God's truth." The priest placed the little golden idol out of danger. Then he stooped and bound the ropes more tightly about the ankles of the prostrate man. Sorez watched him with new interest, almost with a new hope. He glanced at the girl and saw her kneeling upon the raft, her white face to the moon. The priest bent to fasten the rope which already bit into the flesh above the arms. It was for this Sorez had prayed. As the priest stooped, his long coat swayed within reach of the long-waiting fingers. Sorez gripped both laps, and that grip was the grip of death. Before the priest understood the situation, Sorez had bent his bound legs double beneath him and, gripping the tightly bound straw with his heels, shoved with all his strength towards the edge of the raft. The priest fell atop of him, but instantly tore himself back. The fingers held. Once again Sorez hitched forward, and once again the priest came with him. In a panic the crazed priest bore his knees down upon the prostrate man and then swung off to one side. but the fingers held. Sorez was now lying with his head half over the edge. The silver waters lipped his gray hair. He raised his legs once more, just once more, and shoved. He gained an inch. Then, in a flash, the priest managed to stand up with Sorez still clinging, but only for a moment, when he fell backwards, striking the back of his head sharply upon the logs. The girl screamed in fright. The priest saw the world swim before his eyes, and the next second looked up to find a woman, his own daughter, his Jo, looking back at him. But Sorez still clung, and still shoved with his legs towards the edge of the boat. "For God's sake, what are you about?" gasped he who a moment gone had been the priest. Sorez saw nothing of the change. He was busy bending up his legs, digging in his heels, and shoving. "Father! Father!" Sorez had heard the cry before. He felt the girl beating at him with her white hands. The raft was beginning to settle. In the heavy fall of the two men a section had been loosened so that now it might possibly hold two of them, no more. The girl realized this. The man realized this. Sorez knew nothing, save his determination to drag the priest to the bottom with him. "Let him go!" shouted the girl. "Let him go! He is my father! Can't you hear?" The words penetrated just as he was about to shove once more. "Your father?" "Quick! We are sinking!" He let go. The priest sprang to his feet. The canoe had gone, and the loosely constructed raft was settling as timber after timber freed itself. Sorez, himself again, saw this. Without a word he shoved once more, this time himself alone. He went down, and the raft floated. He had kept his word after all. He had given the girl her father. End of chapter 25. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 26 of The Web of the Golden Spider. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. The Web of the Golden Spider by Frederick Bartlett. Chapter 26. A Lucky Bad Shot. As soon as they recovered sufficient strength to desire anything more of life than rest for their bruised and wearied bodies, Wilson assumed command of the situation. He saw nothing but a straight path to the girl. "We must get down to the lake," he said firmly. "Get down there and find Sorez. If the natives are up in arms, I want to be near the girl. I'm going to take her out of here. If the others refuse to join us, we'll take her alone and make a dash for it." "We ought to get our provisions first," suggested Stubbs. "No. What strength we have left is for her." "We'll have twice as much with grub." "And we'll have less time." Wilson's jaw was set. To go down the mountain and back would take at least 4 hours and leave them even nearer dead than they were at present. Aside from that, the desire to see the girl had become an obsession. He was no longer amenable to reason. He felt the power to dominate. In the last 2 days he had learned that there are at least 2 essential things in life, 2 things a man has a right to take where he finds them: love and water. The 2 lay at his feet now, and he would wait no longer. His heart burned with as hot a thirst as his throat. Neither Sorez nor gold nor all the brown men in the universe should balk him of them longer. Leaning forward, he gripped the arm of his comrade with a strength the latter had not thought within him. "Old man," he said with a new ring in his voice. "You must follow me the rest of this journey. I've got down to one thing now. Just one thing. I'm going to find this girl. I'm going to take her into these two arms, and I'm going to carry her out of here and never let her go. Do you understand? And there isn't gold enough, nor men enough, nor heathen images enough in the world to stop me now. We're going back, Stubbs, the girl and I. We're going back, and God help those who get in our way." At first Stubbs thought this was the fever, but as he looked at the tense face, the locked jaw, the burning eyes, he saw it was only a man in earnest. Some spark within his own breast warmed to life before this passion. He put out his hand. "And I signs with you right here." "I've turned aside for things all I'm going to," ran on Wilson excitedly. "Now I'm going over them. I'm going straight. I'm going hard. And I'm not going to turn my back on her again for a second. Do you understand, Stubbs? She's mine, and I'm going to take her." "You won't have to take her if you feel that way," answered Stubbs. "What do you mean?" "She'll go, boy. She'll go through hell with you with that look in your eyes." "Then come on," shouted Wilson with quite unnecessary fierceness. "I'm going to pull out of this heathen web." The two men rose to their tired feet, every muscle protesting, and before dark Stubbs learned how little the body counts, how little anything counts, before the will of a man who has focused the might of his soul upon a single thing. They moved down ever towards the blue lake which blinked back at the sun like a blue-eyed babe. Their rifles pressed upon their shoulders like bars of lead. Their heavy feet were numb. Their eyes bulged from their heads with the strain of keeping them open. Of the long, bitter struggle it is enough to say that it was a sheer victory over the impossible. Each mile was a blank, yet they pressed forward, Wilson ever in the lead, Stubbs ever plodding behind. It was almost as though they were automatons galvanized by some higher intelligence, for their own had become numbed save to the necessity of still dragging their feet ahead. In this way they reached the shores of the lake. In this way they circled it. In this way they neared the hut of Flores. Stumbling along the trail, guided by some instinct, Wilson raised his head at the sight of two figures sitting in the sun by the door of the hut. One was the girl, he saw that clearly enough, for to his own vision it was as the sun breaking through low-hanging clouds. But the other, he motioned Stubbs to halt. The two had made no noise, coming up through the undergrowth from the lake, and were now able to conceal themselves partly behind a sort of high bush. Had those in the hut been alert, the two could not have escaped detection. But so intent they seemed upon their conversation that a dozen men might have approached. Wilson tried to control himself. He wished to make sure. Steadying himself by a grip upon the shoulder of Stubbs, he looked again. Then, bending close to his comrade's ear, he asked him, waiting without drawing breath for a reply, "Who is it?" The answer came charged with bitterness. "The priest." Wilson lowered his rifle. The priest was sitting some 2 feet from the girl, against the hut, his head thrown back as though he were trying hard to think. Wilson was a good shot. He had as a boy amused himself by the hour with his small .22 caliber rifle. At this moment, however, his sight was none of the best, and his hand anything but steady. Stubbs signaled him to let him try the shot, but Wilson would not trust him. He had no doubt but that the priest had killed Sorez and was now holding the girl a prisoner, perhaps even anticipating her death. It was his duty, his privilege, to set her free. He fitted the stock of the weapon into his armpit and raised the barrel. His hand was weak. The gun trembled so that he dared not shoot. Stubbs saw this and, stepping in front of him, motioned him to rest the barrel on his shoulder. With this support he found his aim steadier. He purposely gave a bit of a margin to the right, so that in case of any deflection the error would be away from the girl. He pulled the trigger. When the wisp of smoke cleared away, Wilson saw that both figures were upon their feet, the girl in the arms of the priest who held her close to him as though to protect her. Their eyes were upon him. The girl stared in terror, then in surprise, and now, struggling free, stood as though looking at an apparition. Wilson understood nothing of this. His brain was now too slow working to master fresh details. He still grasped nothing but the fact that the girl was there and by her side the man who had proved himself a mortal enemy. He raised his weapon once more. With a scream the girl ran straight ahead towards him, in line with the astonished man by the hut. As she ran she called, "David! David! David!" He heard the call and, dropping the rifle, staggered towards her. He held out his arms to her and she checked her steps, studying his eyes as though to make sure he was sane. He stood motionless, but there was a prayer in his silent lips, in his eyes, in his outstretched arms. She took another little step towards him, then, without further hesitation, came to his side and placed her head upon his shoulder. He folded his arms over her heaving shoulders. He rested his cheek upon her black hair. He whispered her name again and again. So they stood, Stubbs and the priest both staring at them as at the central figures upon the stage, until she raised her head to look once more into his eyes. He saw her lips within a few inches of his own, but he dared not kiss them yet. It was odd. He had never in his life spoken an audible word of love to her, had never written of love to her, and yet he knew that she knew all that had been unsaid, even as he did. There had never been need of words with them. Love had been developed in the consciousness of each in silence and in loneliness, but had moved to this climax as surely and as inevitably as though foreordained. He had but to look down into her eyes now, and all was said. She had but to look into his, even deadened as they were by fatigue, to read all her heart craved. Her breath came in little gasps. "David, David, you have come for me again." "For the last time," he answered. "You are never going to let me go again, are you, David?" "Never," he answered fiercely. "Ah, hold me tight, David." He drew her more firmly to him. "Tighter, tighter," she whispered. He crushed her against his pounding heart. He ached with the joy of it. But with the relief from the heavy burden of fear which had for so long weighed him down, nature asserted herself and forced down his leaden eyelids. She felt him sinking in her arms and freed herself. With her hands upon his shoulders, she drew back and looked hungrily at him. His sandy hair was tangled and frowsy, his eyes shot with tiny threads of red, his cheeks bronzed and covered with a shaggy light beard. His clothes were tattered, and about his waist there dangled a circle of leather bags. He was an odd enough looking figure. By some strange chance she had never seen him in other than some uncouth garb. Drenched with rain, draped in an oriental lounging robe, with a cartridge belt about his waist, and covered with sweat and powder grime, and now in this. Both were brought back to the world about them by a shot from Stubbs. He had fired at the priest and missed. It was as though the man led a charmed life. The girl raised her hand as Stubbs was about to fire again. "Don't! Don't! You are making a terrible mistake. This isn't the priest. He is my father." The phrase awoke even the sleeping sense of these men. "Your father!" exclaimed Wilson. But the man was coming towards them, steadily, and yet as in a sort of daze. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. The eyes, the high cheekbones, the thin lips, were those of the priest, but the voice was different. It had lost something of its harshness, something, too, of its decisiveness. The girl interrupted. "This is no time for explanations. Come into the hut. We must rest first." She led the way, keeping a tight grip upon Wilson's arm, steadying him. Stubbs and he whom they had known as the priest followed. Within the hut Flores and his wife, still bewildered by the sudden conversion of the priest from an enemy to a friend, understanding nothing of what had happened, crouched far into the rear, overcome with genuine awe and reverence for the guardian of their God in his new character. Threats had driven them to rebellion, while kindliness now made of them abject slaves. They stood ready to obey his slightest wish, not with cravenness, but with quick reversion to the faith of their ancestors. But he acted as though he did not see them, as though, in fact, he saw nothing of anything about him save the girl. He followed her with his eyes with almost childlike eagerness and greeted a glance from her with almost pathetic joy. He spoke little, apparently finding difficulty in expressing himself, in forming his scattered thoughts into correct sentences. His whole appearance was that of a man freed after a long imprisonment. The only thing of his present surroundings which he now grasped perfectly was his relationship with the girl. He was reviving old-time joys in his daughter. But Jo herself, even in the freshness of her happiness over the unexpected success of her long journey, had found an even greater interest in this newer passion. She spread a blanket for Wilson in a corner of the hut, and forced him to lie down here and give himself up to sleep. Stubbs sank to the ground in the sun where he stood outside and fell into a stupor. Hour after hour the girl sat at Wilson's side as though guarding his rest, and in this gentle task she found a new conception of happiness. Near her, during the long vigil, sat her father, while in and out, softly as two shadows, moved Flores and his wife. Wilson awoke long before Stubbs and insisted upon getting up. There were many things to be learned and many things to be done. He realized that they were still in the heart of a hostile country, and that if they were to get out safely, time could not be wasted in sleep. What part this man whom he still thought of as the priest would play, he had no idea. The girl told him as much of the odd story as she had gathered, beginning with her own arrival in the hut. Manning's memory dated from the blow on the raft. Back of this he skipped an interval of 15 years. Even there his memory was cloudy. He recalled vaguely having joined an expedition which had for its object prospecting in these mountains, but who the others of the party were he did not know. He remembered hazily the trip over the mountains and a battle with a party of natives. He was injured and after this was sick a long time. As far as he was concerned, he had been unconscious ever since that time. Of his recovery, of the strange sequence of events which caused him to take up a life among the Chibcas, who elevated him finally into the position of high priest, of the fanatical devotion to his trust which had driven him across the continent and then across an ocean to recover the image, he recalled nothing. He did not know of the existence of an idol or of any superstition in connection with it. Wilson, listening, marveled, but he quickly associated this with similar cases of dual identity brought about by brain trouble following an accident to the skull. The psychology of the case, however, did not at present so much interest him as the possible consequences to them all which might follow this denouement. It instantly occurred to him that it was doubtful if Manning in his present condition was anything but an added menace to the party. A half-hour's questioning convinced Wilson that it was literally true that the last 15 years were a blank to the man, and that his mental condition at present was scarcely superior to that of a child. Consequently, in the event of an attack by the aroused natives, either Manning would be thought to have been captured by the party, which would bring down swift vengeance, or he would be thought to have deserted them, which was equally sure to bring about the annihilation of them all. The only thing to do seemed to be to keep the man out of sight as much as possible on the journey, and in the event of trouble to hide him altogether. It seemed to him wisest not to allow them to rest even that night, but to push on. Flores, eager to do anything for the priest, agreed to guide them. He aroused Stubbs, and after a good meal, the party started and without incident made 8 miles before they stopped. They found a good camping place, a sort of crude cave near a brook and just off the trail. They built a fire and cooked a portion of the leg of mutton which Flores had brought for them before returning. So far they had not caught a glimpse of a native. This fact and the excitement of actually being upon the home path banished them completely from their minds. But that night both men agreed that each had better take his turn at watching. "I'll take the first watch," insisted Wilson to Stubbs. "I wouldn't trust you to wake me up." With a good-natured grin, Stubbs submitted and threw his tired body on the turf, making a pillow of the bags of jewels. He slept as heartily as though snug in the bunk of a safe ship. But both the girl and her father refused to take Wilson's advice and do likewise. Both insisted upon sharing his watch with him. The father sat on the other side of his daughter staring, as though still wondering, into the shadows of the silent wood kingdom about him. He spoke but little and seemed to be still trying to clear his thoughts. At their backs rose the towering summits which still stood between them and the ocean. Above those the stars which from the first had seemed to watch their lives. Before them the heavy, silent shadows which bade them be ever alert. Wilson sat upright with his rifle over his knees. The girl nestled against his shoulder. All was well with the world. End of chapter 26. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 27 of The Web of the Golden Spider. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. The Web of the Golden Spider by Frederick Bartlett. Chapter 27. Dangerous Shadows. In the narration of what had befallen her while in the care of Sorez, Wilson came to have a new conception of the man. With the exception of the fact that Sorez had considered his own interest alone in bringing the girl down here, and that he had lured her on by what he knew to be a deliberate lie, Sorez had been as kind and as thoughtful of her as her own father could have been. After their imprisonment in Bogova and while in hiding from Wilson, he had supplied the girl with the best of nurses and physicians. Furthermore, in order to make what recompense he could to her in case of an accident to him or in the event of the failure of their mission, he had, before leaving Bogova, made his will, bequeathing to her every cent of his real and personal property. The chief item of this was the house in Boston which he had purchased as a home for himself and niece, a few months before the latter's death. In addition to this he had in the end made the supreme sacrifice. He had given his life. Sitting there in the starlight, she told Wilson these things, with a sob in her voice. "And so he kept his word after all, didn't he? He brought me to him." The older man by her side looked up at her. "My daughter," he murmured. "My daughter." She placed her arm over his shoulder, scarcely able to believe the good fortune which had at once placed her here between her father and her lover. "The golden idol did some good after all," she whispered. "The idol?" asked her father. "What idol?" "You remember nothing of an image?" broke in Wilson. "An image? An idol? I have seen them, but I can't remember where." He spoke with a sort of childlike, apologetic whine. Wilson hesitated a moment. He had brought the idol with him after finding it in the hut where Manning had carried it from the raft, apparently unconsciously, and had taken it, fearing to leave it with Flores. He had intended to throw it away in the mountains in some inaccessible place where it could never again curse human lives. This image ought to be final proof as to whether or not Manning could recall anything of his life as a priest of the sun god or not. If the sight of this failed to arouse his dead memory, then nothing ever could. Of all the things in this life among these mountains, no one thing had ever figured so prominently or so vitally in his life as this. About this had centered all his fanatical worship, all his power. As Wilson rose to get the image from where he had hidden it near Stubbs, the girl seized his arm and, bending far forward, gasped, "The shadow! Did you see it?" Wilson turned with his weapon cocked. "Where?" he demanded. But underneath the trees where she had thought she saw a movement, all was quiet again, all was silent. With a laugh at her fears, Wilson secured the image and brought it back. He thrust it towards Manning. It was clearly visible in the moonlight. The girl shrank a little away from it. "Oh," she uttered, "I don't like to look at it tonight." In the dull silver light it appeared heavier and more somber than in the firelight. It still sat cross-legged with the same cynical smile about its cruel mouth, the same bestial expression about the brow, the same low-burning fires in the spider-like eyes. As Wilson and her father bent over it, she turned away her head. Once again she seized Wilson's arm and bade him look beyond the thicket in front of them. "I saw something move. I am sure of it." "You are a bit nervous, I'm afraid," he said tenderly. "If only you would lie down for the rest of the night." "No, no, David. I am sure this time." "Only a shadow. There is a light breeze." "I couldn't see anything, but it didn't feel like a shadow, David." "You felt it? Has the image—" he asked a bit anxiously. "No. Oh, I can't make you understand, but I'm sure something moved in the bushes." "Stay close to me then," he laughed quietly. He turned back to Manning, who was turning the image over and over in his hands with indifferent interest. To him it was nothing more than a curio, a metal doll. But when he caught the glint of a moonbeam on the jeweled eyes, he bent over it with keener concern. He raised it in his hands and stared steadily back into the cold eyes. This stare soon became fixed, and Manning began to grow slightly rigid. Wilson snatched the object from his hands. For a moment the man remained immovable, then he rubbed his hand over his brow, muttering incoherently to himself. This nervous symptom disappeared and Manning apparently instantly forgot the idol again. He called for his daughter. She came closer to his side and he rested his head against her shoulder. "Dear father," she murmured affectionately. I can't think," he said. "Don't try, Daddy. Wait until we get out of here and you are all well again." "If I could reach my ship," he muttered. "What ship, Daddy?" "Why, my own. The Joe Manning." That took her back to the time she was a very little girl. She remembered now that he had named the ship after her, the last ship which he had sailed out of Newburyport. Poor old Daddy! What a different man he was this moment from him who had held her in his arms and kissed her with tears rolling down his bronzed cheeks. It wrenched her heart to watch him sitting there so listlessly, so weakly, so little himself. The fear was growing in her heart that he never would be the same again. Almost it was better to remember him as he was then than to know him as he sat there now. Had it not been for the comfort, for the joy of another order, for the safety she felt in this younger man by her side, her heart would have broken at the sight. If only she could have found him during those few days he was in Boston, when the crystals had first shown him to her, when he must have passed within a few feet of her, it might not then have been so difficult to rouse him. But at that time he would not have known his own. A bedlam of raucous, clamorous shrieks settling into a crude sort of war cry brought all four of them to their feet. Wilson thrust the girl back of him towards the cave-like formation behind them. This effectually protected them in the rear and partly from two sides. Stubbs swept the bag of jewels into his arms and carried them to one corner of this natural excavation. Then he took his position by the side of Wilson and Manning, who was unarmed. The three waited the approach of the unseen demons. Not a light, not the glint of a weapon could be seen. But before their eyes, in and out among the trees making up the dense growth, shadows flitted back and forth in a sort of ghost dance. In addition to the hoarse shouting, the air was rent from time to time by the sound of a blast as from a large horn. The effect of this upon Manning, who had been thrust behind them by Wilson, was peculiar. At each blast he threw back his head and sniffed at the air as a war horse does at the sound of the bugle. His eyes brightened, his lean frame quivered with emotion, his hands closed into tight knots. The girl, observing this, crept closer to him in alarm. She seized his arm and called to him, but he made no response. "Father! Father!" she shouted above the din. He started forward a pace, but she drew him back. Seeing her, he came to himself again for a moment. She scarcely knew him. The old look of intensity, which strained almost every feature out of the normal, had transformed him. He stood now as it were between two personalities. He partially realized this, for he stepped forward behind Wilson and shouted, "They come! They come! I think I can stop them for a little. If I do, don't delay. Don't wait for me." Wilson thought he rambled. "Do you hear? Quick, tell me!" "Yes," shouted Wilson. The din seemed to be approaching in an ever-narrowing circle. It came from all sides, a noise so deafening, so full of unusual sounds that it was in itself terrifying. Again came the blast, followed by another and another. Manning caught sight of the image upon the ground. It acted like magic. He snatched it up, but the girl, regardless of danger, ran to his side. "Don't!" she cried in a panic. "What is the matter, Father?" He looked down at her with eyes which scarcely reflected any recognition. "Don't go, Father! Don't you know me? Don't you know your daughter? See, I am Joe! Joe! Do you understand?" Even in the midst of this other danger, the noise and imminent peril, the two men heard and turned away their heads at the sight with throats straining with emotion. Manning looked back with hardly a gleam of his true self showing in his eyes. And yet there was something left which made him pause, which in one flash brought him back for a second. He stooped and kissed her. Then he raised himself and facing the two men pointed towards the woods behind them. "Go!" he commanded. Another blast and he clutched the idol to his breast. He raised his eyes to the east and the three stood dumbfounded. From his throat there issued a cry so wild, so weird, that it checked their breathing. Instantly following there was silence from the shadows. 1, 2, 3, 4 seconds passed. Still that silence which was nerve-racking in its intensity. Then a cry rang out from among the trees so piercing that the girl put her arm up over her eyes as though to ward off a blow. 100 forms appeared from the trees. Stubbs and Wilson raised their rifles. But with a sweeping motion back with his hand, the priest bade the two men pause. He disappeared into the shadows, where he was greeted with a sort of paean of joy. Then silence. Then a few sharp-spoken words. Then silence again. Wilson, scarcely believing this was not some evil dream, gripped Stubbs's arm. "Come," he gasped. "Let's get out. This is hell." He took the half-swooning girl in his arms. "Get a grip on yourself, Joe, just for a little. We must go at once." "But Daddy, Daddy!" Wilson closed his eyes as though to shut out the sight he had last seen when looking into the face of that man. "It is better as it is." Stubbs, still with a care for the jewels, helped Wilson on with his belt and fastened his own into place. He had had a good rest and felt comparatively fresh, but the others tottered as they walked. Into the dark among the trees they went, following the faint trail which led towards the big mountains, which were still a barrier. On, on, on until the girl dropped into her tracks from exhaustion, and Wilson beside her. For 6 hours Stubbs maintained a grim watch over the two, his rifle across his knees, hoping against hope for one bit of good luck more, that if so be there was another attack he might have at least one fair shot at the priest. Whether the man was the girl's father or not, and he privately doubted the story, he felt that this was the only thing which would ever take from his mouth the taste of rope. But he was disappointed. The morning broke fair and peaceful with, so far as they could see, the birds and squirrels the only occupants of this forest besides themselves. In fact, the next 3 days, save for the strain of being constantly alert, were a sort of idyll for Wilson and Joe. They had little difficulty in shooting sufficient food for their needs, and water was plentiful. The trail led through a fair land gay, at this time of year, with many flowers. The girl, to be sure, sobbed at first a good deal in the dark, but the two men knew nothing of this. Soon after the first acute pain of the personal loss, she was able to reason a little with herself. It seemed to her then, remembering how much a child he was when with her, and how strong and powerful he looked as he stepped into the woods, that perhaps, after all, he would be happier with his many children than with her. Then always there was the opportunity of coming back to him, coming under better auspices and with better opportunities for really bringing him to his own. It was this last thought that finally brought her real consolation. "Perhaps," she said to Wilson, hesitating a trifle in fear that he might not approve of the suggestion, "perhaps some day we can come back here to him, David." "I had thought of it, dear. He saved our lives. If he had remained, not one of us would have got out of here. That in itself is enough to make us everlastingly beholden to him. But—" He paused. "I think, dear heart, that it is kinder to let him remain even among heathen people, a strong man with power, than to bring him back a child to die." "He chose for himself, David." "Yes, and was able to realize and be glad that he had been given another chance to do for his daughter." The girl thought a moment. Then her face brightened. That alone makes the trip worth while." "That and this," he answered, drawing her to his side. "Yes," she whispered, "and in a way he gave me you. He gave me you." End of chapter 27. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 28 of The Web of the Golden Spider. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. The Web of the Golden Spider by Frederick Bartlett. Chapter 28. A Dash for Port. The Queen of Carlina, after a restless night, rose one fair morning early in October and dressed herself long before the appearance of her maids. There had been much to disturb her sleep, rumor upon rumor and arrest after arrest during the last few days, and last night a long conference with her advisers. Before she retired she had turned wearily to Otaballo, who remained a few minutes after the others departed. "My general," she said, "I'm tired of it all. Let them do as they will." "Not so long as there is a loyal man to carry a gun," he answered stubbornly. "You are old, General. It is time you had peace." "I am as young as my queen." "She is very old tonight," she answered with a weary smile. "I fear I am not a real queen, just a woman. And women grow old quickly without love." The general bit his mustache. He had long seen that it was more this than the plotting of the revolutionists which was undermining his power. He did not know how to answer. "You have the love of your people." "Not even that. The sentiment of love for their queen is dead. That is the root of the whole matter. There is but one thing then for me to do, to retire gracefully, to anticipate their wishes, to listen to their cry and declare a republic. Then you and I will go back to the cottage together and drink our tea in peace." "You are wrong. That is not the wish of the people. It is the wish only of a few hundred black guards led on by those devils brought here from over the sea." "You mean Dick's men?" "The devil's men. If you give me authority, I'll have every mother's son of them shot before morning." She shook her head. "Not even to please my bloodthirsty general. They have played us false, but still they are countrymen of his." "You insult him. They belong to no country." "Why?" she asked thoughtfully. "Why should I expect them to fight for me? Perhaps they think I played Dicky false. They have reason. He is not here where he won his right to be." "Then for the love of God, bring him here," he answered, forgetting himself. She started at that. "No, no," she cried hastily, as though fearing he might make the attempt to find him. "Not to save the kingdom. You should listen to me to night, General. I am very wise. The reports which have come in are without exception bad. You arrest here, you arrest there, but still the people gather and still they state their wishes. I know how it is. At first they were amused to have their queen, it was like a holiday. Especially when Dicky talked to them. But freedom is in the blood and it is foolish to fight against it as against the foreign ships we once tried to keep out of our harbor. Carlina, the old Carlina, your Carlina and mine, is no more." She paused at the look of horror which had crept over his withered face. She dropped her hand to his arm. "Do I sound disloyal? It is only because the kingdom remains as it used to be in your dear heart and yours alone. I am your queen, General, because you are still in the past. But the others are not. They are of the present and to them I am only a tradition. If they were all like you, my heart and soul, my life and love would all be theirs. It is to save what is left of the former things, to save you and the few others of that old kingdom, to have our dear Carlina as we used to have it out there in the sunshine of the garden, that I would leave this turmoil before it is too late." The white head drooped as she spoke, drooped low over the wrinkled hands clasped upon the jewel sword handle. Dreams, dreams that had seemed about to come true in these his later years, now faded before his misty eyes. He had thought to see, before he died, the glory of the former times returned, and now his queen was the first to call them dead. For the moment he felt himself as solitary as one returned from the grave. But, as she had said, if there were more like Otaballo the kingdom would still be, without all this strife. His stubborn thoughts refused to march into the present. He raised his head again, still a general of Carlina. "Your Majesty," he said, "there is but one way in which a servant of the house of Montferaldo may save himself." And clicking his heels together, he had turned with military precision and left her. Then she had tossed the night long, dreaming horrible things. Now she sat in her private apartments, staring with troubled eyes over the sunlit grounds. So an hour passed, when, without warning, the door snapped open, closed, and she looked up, startled, to see Danbury himself. Her breath was cut off as though her heart had been stopped, as one thrusts in a finger and halts a clock. There was the same dead silence that closes in upon the cessation of the long-continued ticking, a silence as though the whole world paused a moment to listen. He limped across the room to her side. She saw that his hair was disheveled, his coat torn, as though he had been in a struggle. Then his arms closed about her and she felt a great sense of safety, of relief, as though everything had suddenly been settled for her. There was no kingdom, no throne, no Otaballo, no city full of malcontents. Nothing but Dicky. She felt as much at peace as when they used to sit in the garden together. All this other confusion had been only some story which he had told her. But in a minute he drew back from her and thrust the present in again. "Come," he whispered. "We must hurry." "But, Dicky, what is it?" "The city is up in arms. We haven't a second to spare." "And Otaballo, my general?" He clenched his fists at the memory. "Dead. They killed him and a handful of men at his side." "Dead? My general dead?" "Like the brave general he was." She put her hands to her face. He drew her to his shoulder where he let her weep a moment, his own throat big. "Oh, but they shall answer for it," he cried. "Hush, dear. I'm coming back with 1,000 men and make 'em sweat for that." His quick senses caught a sound without. "Come," he commanded. We shall be cut off here." He took her arm and hurried her along. They scurried down the stairs and across the palace grounds to a small gate in the rear. Here a carriage was waiting for them. Danbury helped her in and stooped to kiss her lips before he jumped up beside the driver. "Now drive for your life," he commanded. The whip fell across the quivering flanks of the nervous animals and they leaped forward. The driver kept to the deserted side streets where they raced along unchallenged, but soon it became necessary to turn into the main thoroughfare in order to reach the waterfront and the boat. In the 4 minutes it would require to go those dozen blocks, their fate would be decided. If the army had not yet advanced that far, they would be safe. Otherwise, he must depend upon a dash for it, covering the mob with the 2 revolvers he had. 8 shots to ward off the attack of 1,000 men. Danbury leaned far out over the box as the horses took the turn at a speed which almost swung the rear wheels clear of the ground. The animals had become panic-stricken now and were bolting madly ahead like horses from a burning stable. But though the road looked clear, they had not advanced a block before men sprang up as though from the ground. The populace had heard of the advancing column, and such as had not already joined it prepared to meet it here. In order to avoid immediate suspicion, they were forced to steady the horses down to something like a walk. To Danbury it seemed as though they had stopped stock still. He was not a good man in such a position as this. He was all for dashing action. He could hardly sit still. They received many side glances from the excited groups, but they passed merely as a carriage full of nervous foreigners. Danbury himself was not recognized. So they crept along and Danbury gained hope, until they were within 200 yards of the turn which would take them out of the line of march. Then, with hoarse shouting, the advance line of the revolutionists swept around a corner and directly towards them. They were a yelling horde of half-drunken maniacs, a disordered horde eager for the noisy excitement their Southern blood craved. With half of them it was more the frenzied love of flags and noise that had brought them out than any deep-seated conviction of right. But the thing that brought Danbury to attention was the sight of Splinter with 40 of his fellows from the boat leading the crowd. In an instant he was off the box and inside the carriage. He realized what it would mean to be recognized by him. He had but one thought: to guard the safety of her within. The driver advanced at a walk, keeping as close as possible to the curbing. There was just one chance in 1,000 that the crowd might be too intent upon their goal to bother with passing vehicles. They were not after the Queen herself, for they looked upon her as a mere girl influenced by Otaballo. Should they chance upon her, undoubtedly they would feel obliged to arrest her, but she was not at the moment of such supreme importance as to make them alert to prevent her escape. Danbury knew this. The danger lay in the impudent curiosity of some one of the soldiers. Each felt the license of the lawbreaker. It was the spirit that led them to destroy property for the sheer joy of destroying that he had to fear. He held his weapon ready, sitting far back. The girl was white and calm. They watched the first few stragglers pass in dead silence. They heard the clattering confusion yet to pass. Then a soldier thrust his musket through the glass with a coarse laugh. He peered within, but the girl's face was shielded so that the most he saw was that she was a girl. The muzzle of Danbury's revolver was within a foot of his head, and a finger trembled upon the hair trigger. Still he forced himself to wait a second longer. "Get out, my pretty lady! Get out and join us!" he shouted. "What have you there?" shouted his comrade. Then someone started the cry, The Queen! It may be the Queen!" There was a rush towards the carriage. Danbury fired through the bottom, a signal to the driver to dash for it. The horses sprang but were brought back upon their haunches. Beatrice spoke to Danbury. "Wait, not yet," she pleaded as he raised his weapon. It was almost like Providence. A shout from across the street which grew in volume until it drowned out all other cries. Then a rush in that direction which was followed blindly by every man of them. In a few seconds the carriage was deserted. Danbury rose to his feet and looked out. He almost lost his breath as he saw Stubbs, Wilson, and a girl, the center of 1,000 excited men. The girl, white-cheeked, turned a moment in his direction. He was dumbfounded. Then he caught the cry, "Down with the traitors!" The cry was taken up and voiced by 100 throats. He saw Stubbs thrust his fists in the faces of the crowding men, saw him fight them back until his own blood boiled with the desire to stand by his side. But the driver had whipped up the horses again and the carriage was taking him away, out of danger, to her. In spite of the look of quick relief he saw in the face of Beatrice, he felt almost like a deserter. It was what Stubbs took to be a return of the bad luck which had pursued him from childhood, this chance which led the three into the city at such a time as this. They had thought of nothing when they rose early that morning but of pushing through as soon as possible to Bogova. Wilson felt that it was nigh time that the girl reached civilization, even as crude as it was in that city, with some of its comforts. The hardships were beginning to show in her thin cheeks and in dark rings below her eyes. The outskirts of the city told them nothing, and so they trudged along with joyous hearts, intent only upon finding decent lodgings. They had not even the warning of a shout for what was awaiting them. The upper street had been empty and they had turned sharply into this riot as though it were a trap set to await them. Both men were quick to understand the situation and both realized that it meant danger. But Stubbs was the first to shake himself free. He recognized the crew at the head of the motley army. It roused his ire as nothing else could. Instantly he felt himself again their master. They were still only so many mutinous sailors. He turned upon them with the same fierceness which once had sent them cowering into the hold. "You yeller dogs!" he roared. "Get back! Get back!" They obeyed, even though they stood at the head of 1,000 men, they obeyed. Once these fellows admitted a man their master, he remained so for all time. They shrank before his fists and dodged the muzzle of his revolver as though they were once again within the confines of a ship. In a minute he had cleared a circle. "Now," shouted Stubbs, "tell 'em we're through with their 2-cent revolution. Tell 'em we're Americans, just plain Americans. Tell 'em that, and that I'll put a bullet through the first man that lays a hand on one of us. Splinter, you blackguard, tell 'em that! Tell 'em that!" Through a Carolinian lieutenant who understood English, Splinter made the leaders understand something of what Stubbs had said. They demurred and growled and shouted their protests. But Splinter added a few words of his own and they became quieter. "Huh?" exploded Stubbs impatiently. "Perhaps some of 'em remembers me. Tell 'em we're goin' home, and tell 'em that when American is bound for home, it don't pay fer to try to stop him. Tell 'em we ain't gonna wait, we're goin' now." He turned to Wilson. "Come on," he commanded. Throwing up his arms, he pressed back the men before him as a policeman brushes aside so many small boys. Whether it was the sheer assurance of the man, whether it was his evident control over their allies, or whether it was all over before they had time to think, they retreated and left a clear path for him. "You boys guard our rear," he shouted back to Splinter, "and when we're out of sight you can go to hell." Obedient to the command, the small band of mercenaries took their place behind the three retreating figures. The latter made their way across the street without hurrying and without sign of fear. They turned a corner and so disappeared from sight. The army paused a moment. Then someone raised a new cry and it moved on, in 3 minutes forgetting the episode. Stubbs at the corner found himself in the arms of an excited man who, revolver in hand, had run back to meet him. "Lord!" exclaimed Danbury. "I was afraid I was too late." Without further parley he hurried the girl into the closed carriage and with a yell over his shoulder for the two men to follow, clambered back upon the box. "The boat's at the dock," he shouted. "Steam all up! Get on behind!" The two men had their hands full to keep pace on foot with those wild horses, but the distance was short. In less than an hour the group was all on board the yacht which had her nose pointed straight for the open sea. End of chapter 28. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 29 of The Web of the Golden Spider. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. The Web of the Golden Spider by Frederick Orrin Bartlett. Chapter 29. The Open Door Closes. It was an excited but happy group of people who sat down that night in the cozy cabin of the yacht after a good day's rest. Each of them had more than he could tell, for no one would allow the other to omit any details of these last adventurous weeks. Each had been held in the clutch of a widely differing set of circumstances, and each had been forced to make something of a lone fight of it. Here in the calm and luxury of this cabin their lives, by the grace of God, had come to a focus. First, Danbury, as the host, was forced to begin from the time he was lost at the gate to the palace. He told of how he awoke in a certain house and found himself under the care of the best nurse in the world. But that didn't last long, for the next thing he knew he was on board his yacht and 50 miles out at sea with a mutinous captain, a captain who refused to put back to port when ordered to do so at once. Instead of that, the fellow ran him into a strange port, took on board a surgeon, shanghaied him in fact, and refused to obey orders until 3 weeks later Danbury was himself again plus a limp. Then he had come back to Bogova only to be refused permission to anchor in the harbor. He had come ashore one night in a dory, been arrested and carried before Otaballo, who refused to recognize him and gave him the alternative of going to jail or leaving the coast at once. It had all been an incomprehensible mystery to him, the only explanation he could think of being that the Queen was seized by the general who had usurped the throne. He tried once more to land, and this time learned of the movement afoot by the Republican party. He had made a dash for the palace, forced his way through the guards, and reached the Queen. Now he'd like an explanation from Her Majesty of the unfair advantage she had taken of a wounded prisoner. Her Majesty, with an excited, happy laugh, said that if boys would get excited and act foolishly, the only thing to do was to keep them out of trouble by force. It was true that she had conspired to have him transported and kept safe aboard his ship, because she knew that if he came back, he would resent a great many things she was forced to bear as a matter of diplomacy, and would end by getting stabbed in the back. She thought it was better to have a live lover, even though he were 100 miles away, than a dead soldier. He scowled in disgust, but she reached his hand under the table. She had given orders to Otaballo, and then she had lain awake all night crying, because he had carried them out. Her plan had been to get the kingdom all straightened out and at peace, and then to abdicate. But things had gone wrong, and she told them a story of plots and counterplots, of strange men arrested at her very door with knives in their hands, of a bomb found in the palace that held them breathless. Danbury fairly boiled over with excitement. "And you had me tied up while those things were going on? Trix, I'll never forgive you. I might have been a regular storybook hero." "Not in Carlina. You'd have been killed before night." "Rot! Don't you think I'm old enough to take care of myself?" "No," she answered, "and that's why I've come with you." "I'd have cleared up that trouble in a week," he exploded. "And as for those beggars of mine, do you know I risked my life to get their pay to them through an agent, and then they turned against us." "Still for pay," she said. "Well, their life will be a short one and a merry in that crowd. Once the darned Republic is running again, they will be got rid of." If Danbury squirmed at having missed the excitement at Bogova, he fairly writhed with envy of Stubbs and Wilson. As he listened, he hitched back and forth in his chair, leaned over the table until he threatened to sprawl among the glasses, and groaned jealously at every crisis. Wilson told his story as simply as possible from its beginning: the scenes at the house, his finding the map, his adventures in Bogova, the long trip to the cave, his dangers there, and their dash back with the treasure, omitting, however, the story of the priest's relation to the girl, as of too personal a nature. At this point the black coffee was brought on, the steward dismissed, and as a climax to the narrative the contents of the 20 bags of jewels poured out upon the table. They made a living, sparkling heap that held every one of them in silent wonder. Beneath the electric lights they took on their brightest hues, darting rays in all directions, a dazzling collection which in value and beauty was greater than any which has ever been gathered at one time. Today they are scattered all over the world. There is not a collection in Europe which is not the richer for one or more of them. They flash upon the fingers of royalty, they sparkle upon the bosom of our own richest, they are locked tight in the heavy safes of London Jews, and at least 4 of them the Rajah of Lamar ranks among the choicest of what is called the most magnificent collection in the world. But the 2 finest of them all, neither the money of Jews nor the influence of royalty was powerful enough to secure. One came as a wedding gift to Mrs. Danbury, and the other was a gift from Stubbs to Joe. For a few minutes they lay there together, as for so long they had lain in the cave, a coruscating fortune of many millions. "Well," gasped Danbury, "you fellows certainly got all the fun and a good share of the profit out of this trip. But did you say you left a pile behind?" "In gold, 20 times what these are worth," said Wilson. "And you could locate it again?" "It's buried under a mountain now, but you're welcome to the map if you wish to dig for it. I don't want any more of it. I found what I was after." He looked at Joe, who had become as silent as ever the wife of Flores was. She had learned the same trick of the eyes, a sort of sheep-like content. "But Stubbs," broke out Danbury, "will you go back with me? We'll take dynamite and men enough to blow out the whole mountain. Say, it will be bully and—" He felt warm fingers close over his own. It sent a thrill the length of him, but also it told him that things were different now, that he must not plan for himself alone. "Well, he added slowly. "Perhaps someday we can go, say 10 years from now. Are you with me, Stubbs?" "It's good enough to stow away to dream about," smiled Stubbs, catching a warning glance from Beatrice. "But as for me, I ain't got the taste of rope out of my mouth yet." They swept back the jewels into the bags and locked them up in Danbury's safe. The latter agreed to take them to New York and see that they were probably appraised so that a fair division could be made. Stubbs protested that it wasn't worth while. "Just give me one bag of 'em and I guess that'll last me out." But Wilson insisted on the literal carrying out of their bargain, share and share alike. The remainder of the trip was a sort of extra honeymoon for Danbury and Wilson, while Stubbs was content to act as chaperone and bask in the reflected happiness about him. The climax came with a double wedding held on board the ship in Boston Harbor, just as soon as they could get a parson on board. The little cabin was a bower of flowers, and what the two girls lacked in gowns, both Danbury and Wilson insisting that to prepare a trousseau was a wholly unnecessary waste of time, they made up in jewels. The dinner which followed was worthy of the Astoria, for Togo, the Japanese steward, was given carte blanche. Stubbs was to go on to New York with Danbury, but as to where he should go from there he was mysterious. "There's a widow at Lisbon," he hinted to Wilson. "If you don't find her, come back to us." "Maybe so, maybe so. It's God bless you both, anyhow, and perhaps we'll meet in the end at the home port." From the dark of their unlighted room in the hotel, Wilson and his wife stood side by side staring down at the interminable procession of shuffling feet in which, so short a time ago, they had been two units. It had been just such a dusk time as this when she had first got a glimpse of this man by her side. The world had seemed very big and formidable to her then, and yet she had felt something of the tingling romance of it. Now, as she gazed down through the misting rain at the glazed streets and the shadows moving through the paths of yellow lights from the windows, she felt a yearning to be a part of them once more. Once again she felt the gypsy call of things beyond. Once again she vibrated attuned to the mystic song of the dark. She felt stifled in here with her love. For the moment she was even rebellious. After the sweep of sky-piercing summits, after the unmeasured miles of the sea, there was not room here for a heart so big as hers. Somehow this room seemed to shut out the sky. She wanted to go down into the crowd for a little and brush shoulders with these restless people. It would seem a little less as though she had been imprisoned. It seemed to her as though she would then be more completely alone with him, alone as they were those first few hours when they had felt the press of the world against them. For this night of nights she craved the isolation which had once been thrust upon them. They were such guarded creatures here. 100 servants hedged them about, hedged them in as zealously as jailers. The law, that old enemy, patrolled the streets now to keep them safe, where once it had thrust them out into the larger universe. Outside still lay the broad avenues of dark where one heard strange passings, where one was in touch with the ungoverned. The rain sifted gently from the uncharted regions above. It was there lovers should be, there where one could swing the shoulders and breathe deeply. The girl snuggled uneasily closer to his side. The two pressed to the windows as though to get as far away as possible from all the man-made furnishings about them. "Joe," he whispered, "we oughtn't to be shut in." She found his hand and grasped it with the strength of one who thrills with the deeper understanding. She trembled in the grip of that love which, at least once in a woman's life, lifts her to a higher plane that can be reached outside a madhouse. She felt a majestic scorn of circumstance. She was one with nature herself. She and her man. She laid her hot cheek against his heart. She had not yet been kissed, withdrawing from his lips half afraid of the dizzy heights to which they beckoned. "Let's get back into the dark, Joe," he whispered again, drawing her towards him. "Back where I found you, Joe. I want to get outside once more, with you. I want to be all alone with you once more." "David! David!" she cried joyously. "I know." "I don't want to start life with you from here. I want to start from where we stood before the fire, all wet. It was there I found you." "Yes, yes," she answered, scarcely able to get her breath. "It was meant for us to begin there. We were turned aside for a little into strange paths, but we'll go back now. Shall we?" "Now," she panted. "Let us start now." "Come," he said. They hurried out of the room and down the broad marble stairs to the hotel foyer, as though fearing something was behind them to seize and hold them prisoner. The smug, well-dressed men and women who were lounging there stared listlessly at the rain, glanced up with a quicker interest in life at sight of their flushed cheeks and eager eyes. They caught in them the living fire which in their own breasts was ash-covered by the years. The man at the swinging doors straightened at their approach. "Shall I get you an umbrella, sir?" "No," answered Wilson with a smile. "It is raining hard, sir." "Yes, it is raining, thank God." They moved out upon the steps and the carriage porter put his whistle to his lips. Wilson shook his head and gripped the arm of the excited girl by his side. "But, sir," gasped the porter. "I'm afraid you don't belong to the night," said Wilson. "Lord!" muttered the porter as he saw them step into the wet. "Lord, they're mad, mad as hatters." They swung into the damp stream of men and women with a fresh influx of strength. They felt the action of the world, the vibrating pulse of the engines. The law still stood on the outside like an umpire, but there were still many forces at work which the law could not detect, many opportunities for chance to work, for the quick hand to move stealthily. It was something of this they felt as they brushed along. But they wished freer play even than this. They wished to get where the law alone stood between them and their ego, and then once more face down the law. They turned into the big dripping park, with its primeval furnishings of earth and grass and trees and deep shadows. It was amid such surroundings alone that their own big, fundamental emotions found adequate breathing space. They plunged into the silent bypaths as a sun-baked man dives to the sandy bottom of a crystal lake. And into it all they blended as one, each feeling the glory of a perfected whole. Each saw with his own eyes and the eyes of the other too. It was as though each were given 5 new senses. Near one of the large trees a shadow detached itself and stepped towards them. It was a man in a rubber coat and a helmet. "See," she whispered to him, "it is one of them." He saw, and the old fighting instinct returned, the old rebellion. But with it came a new responsibility. It was no longer just himself against this thing, no longer the same wild freedom that took no account of consequences. "See?" she trembled. "Shall we run?" Then she clutched his arm more tightly. There was no need of running now. He was there to face things, to stand firm and batter off. "Oh, David," she broke out, we can't run any more." "No," he answered steadily. "We must go straight ahead and pass him." So they did, and as the policemen stooped a little the better to see their faces, they each lifted their eyes to him and laughed. He tipped his helmet. "A bad night, sir," he said genially. "A bully night," answered Wilson. They went on more slowly after this, across the park and toward the broad avenue. They came to where the brownstone houses blinked their yellow eyes at them. The boards were all down now, and the street all a twinkle with fairy lights. "Do you remember how they did that before?" he asked. "And how warm it looked inside? David, David, they can't make me feel lonesome any more." "No, but we can't laugh at them. We must laugh with them." She made up a little face at a big French window which seemed to stare insolently at them. "We don't need you any more," she said to it. They came to the only house on the street which was still boarded against the heat of the summer. Here they paused. She seized his arm. "That is it!" she exclaimed. "That is where we began." "Yes, but it looks different, doesn't it?" "It has grown older, more sober." "Shall we go in?" She looked up and down the street. "If only we could get chased once more." "We can pretend." "And go in the back way as we did before?" "Yes." "That is good. Come." She placed her hand within his and they turned down the alley which led to the back street facing the waterfront. The lights still blinked in the mist, the waves still pounded against the stone walls, throwing up salt spray, but they no longer came from out an unfathomable distance. They seemed like very pretty waves, and the two knew the boundaries, before and back of them, as they had not before. "Now," she said, "run! Run for all you're worth!" She led the pace, he falling back to keep with her instead of dragging her on. So they ran until they were breathless. Then as before they moved a tiptoe. They knew the little door when they reached it. "I must break it in again," he said. So she stood back while he threw his weight against it, meeting it with his shoulders. She watched him with a thrill, her heart leaping with every thud of his body against the wood. It was her man forcing a path for her man beating down a barrier. She felt the sting of the wind-driven spray against her cheek, but the depths from which it came no longer called to her. Rather, they drove her in. She was content to be here with her man. Life opened big to her from just where she stood. The door gave finally, as she knew it must, and hand in hand they entered the paved yard. He fastened the door behind them, and yet as he put the joist in place, it was not as it was before. There was no one in pursuit now. She found herself, however, as anxious to see his face and learn what this meant to him as she had been the first time. For after all, even if it were different, it was just as new and unpathed a world they were entering as the other. She took his hand. "Stoop nearer to me, David." She saw that his lips were less tense, that there was less of a strain to his shoulders, but that his eyes burned no less brightly. "Come," she said. He went in through the window and opened the door for her. The house smelled just as musty as before, but there was less thrill to the dark. They lighted a bit of candle and made their way along the lower hall, up the broad stairs, and so into the very room where they had stood a few months before. There were no strange creakings now, no half-guessed movements among the curtains, no swift gliding shadows more felt than seen. There were no such vast spaces above, and no uncertain alleys of dark. They were among the known things, the certain, the sure. He found kindling and lighted the fire. It flared up briskly and threw flickering rays into the big room. The two pressed close to it, for their clothes were wet. Not a thing was altered in the room, and yet it was a different room. The room was now a part of this house, the house was part of the street was part of the city part of the man-made world. For a moment the walls pressed in upon them as the hotel walls had done, and the ceilings shut out the stars. Then he turned and met her eyes. They were clear now, unshadowed by doubt, fear, or question. He knew what it meant. At length she was altogether out of the web. It was odd, but he had never kissed her lips. He had waited for this. She looked up at him, and as she looked, she seemed to sink deeper than ever into the golden, misty region which lay below the outer dark of his eyes. She felt a tingling warmth suffuse her whole body. She felt the room about her quicken to new life. And above her head she knew the stars were shining again. She came into his arms, putting her hands upon his shoulder, throwing back her head with half-closed eyes. He stooped, his lips brushed her lips, then met firmly in a clinging kiss which set the world about them into a mad riot. End of chapter 29. Recording by Roger Melin. End of The Web of the Golden Spider by Frederick Orrin Bartlett.